brutal, bull-shaped monster with a ringed nose charged forward, and the man snapped into action, calling on the holy spirit of flame to hand him the flame of wrath, the salamander's scorching fire magic. He hurled the magic straight at the target, and boom, a massive explosion ripped through the air, unleashing chaos in Baltsac, the prosperous city of Douglas, the world's greatest wizard where adventurers flocked in from everywhere. People cheered for him like he was a legend. Then he shoved a cart behind his steps, packed with the monster he'd just slain. And once Douglas ended up stumbling into the role of the guild's top wizard by accident, the whole town crowned him as the greatest before he even knew what hit him. Right then he had zero doubt this was the moment he'd keep fighting as an adventurer, and yet. Then someone hit him with the news. His adventurer's license was revoked, his card turned useless, and no more jobs would come his way. 10 years later, Douglas Ford was still out of work. Now this 37-year-old, middle-aged man strides into the Baltsac Adventurers Guild, where Ding, the guild member, greets him, and he immediately asks if he needs to go through the whole license card return procedure. But he refused to hand it back. He demanded they reverse the revocation and restore his license, and the guy knew exactly why. He just bombed 3 ranked quests in a row, so the guild had zero reason to keep trusting him. He finally got what they were fighting through. Turns out every adventurer's guild kept its own shared stash of guild points. Do quests the guild hands you, and both you and the guild rack up guild points. Use those points to unlock rewards, but one failed quest and the whole balance gets wiped clean. And yeah, points matter. If a guild tanks its guild points, the guild masters get demoted and the whole guild gets shut down, and it can happen fast. And it all went up in smoke because the quests he picked were straight up pointless, so who could have guessed his points would crash so hard his license got yanked too. He hadn't been an adventurer for 22 years, and now, at 37, this disaster was finally catching up. His body's crumbling and his stats are sliding lower by the day, but the real nightmare is the odd illness he picked up a year ago. Every time he uses a skill, his max HP gets shaved away. Skills are everything for an adventurer, but the health he just lost is gone for good, and the doctor beside him told him the cruel truth. His body can't keep up with skill use anymore. This guy was his doctor. Then he leaned in and warned him. An odd symptom was creeping in. He'd seen it hit several people already, and if he kept using those skills, his health would crash to zero and he'd die. Should he quit adventuring or die chasing the only life he knows? Trouble is, his single mother is gone, he has no family, and from the moment he was 15, he poured everything into this path. Now he doesn't have a single other skill to fall back on. After everything he's survived, he refuses to let it all slip away, so he storms into the guild with a giant backpack packed with strange treasures, demanding they let him show it off. It was all potions. He was convinced they'd keep him from burning out like before, for as long as they held out. The employee nodded and said they understood his hunger for it, but Douglas, if he wasn't wrong, was sitting at level 68 right now. But his health maxes out at just 2,500, basically beginner level, like some level 10 nobody trekking for the first time, unless he can team up with a healer, but none showed up for half a year. So he tries the C-Rink quest meant for folks around level 30. Does he not see how insane that is? And yep, he knew it all along. But he never meant to blurt out something like that. He had something he needed to tell the hero first, until the voice behind him snapped, "Stop." That was it. The guild master strode over and Douglas finally exhaled. He knew the master would hear him out if he asked. Douglas even said he had a request, but the master's face looked anything but reassuring. He told Douglas to stop right then, because he knew Douglas hated blowing small things up. Yet everyone around them was whispering, calling him an old man, mocking his constant grumbles, and spreading the rumor that his license had been taken away. They mocked him to his face. Then the master snapped that they also owed Douglas. He used to be the guild's best, and they'd never erase what he'd done. So they refused to let him die for nothing, and they needed him to finally understand. No choice remained. He had to leave. He parked himself by the building's entrance, let out a heavy sigh, and wrestled with the moment he'd finally grabbed control and faced the truth head-on. Now he's got no serious gear and barely any cash. His license is already gone, and living costs are crushing him. So he's got to face the truth and get ready to bail, packing up his things and preparing to leave the city. He snapped his eyes up and saw 4 heroes closing in his own team, the same ones who'd kicked him out 6 months ago, and now they were back with Budu, almost 20 years younger than him, blazing forward so fast it stunned him, storming across the road together as a pack. The moment he left this town, that hope of seeing them again felt like it vanished for good, like fate had already written the ending. He strode up to the boys, flashed a greeting, and told them exactly how long it had been since they'd last seen each other. The first ones to greet him were Alan, the warrior, and Fanny, the healer, and when the girl faced him, she lit up and said they hadn't seen each other in forever, and that running into him in this city felt like fate. Off to the side, someone snapped, "It's not a coincidence, he's been waylaying us." They all realized it was Edmund the Sage. He swore that no matter how many times Douglas begged, the answer would never change. They couldn't take him back. He demanded that he try seeing things through their eyes, the ones he'd been persecuting, yet the hero shot him down, claiming he was wrong even though he'd already gone to them once before, right after his exile, begging them to change their minds. But he definitely didn't follow because at that exact moment, stubbornness slammed into him. He admits it. He decided to tell the guys the truth. He was leaving the city today. As he was getting ready, he stumbled right into them by accident, and for a second he panicked, so he decided to say goodbye one last time. Fanny was stunned, and the sage just smiled. He shot back with a sarcastic remark. He couldn't believe there was any city out there where adventurers could live easier than here. Then the real question hit. Why would that guy walk away in the first place? The hero rubbed his cheek with his finger, totally clueless on what to say. Right then, Dario, the team's swordsman, burst in from the side, threw himself into the moment, and started roasting Edmund for that cold answer, because it sounded brutally heartless. He asked the old man if he agreed, then snapped to it. Wasn't that license already gone? And didn't he have that monster of baggage dragging behind him? So what was he even planning next, selling potions? Because at this point, he'd hit rock bottom. He made another mistake, and this time he was going to die for real. The sage burst into laughter, saying it sparked memories of something old. Then he leaned in and asked how far his health had fallen since that moment. Alan, standing right behind him, shouted at the top of his lungs that they needed to stop, like right now. It was insane. He keeps snapping at them to stop wasting their time. Then he begs old Douglas for forgiveness, but they're rushing, so he has to bolt. Meanwhile, the hero trips over his words, stammers, and apologizes to the boys for yapping and keeping them up. He waved goodbye to the girl, and she nodded back without a word. Then Alan, for all his hero status, stayed stone cold, like he couldn't feel a thing, so was he really fighting for him now? As long as he keeps moving, he'll wish them well, then he'll chase the road again. 3 months have already screamed by since he left Baltsac, and he's still dragging himself through this pointless journey. Now he grabs whatever work he can do without a license, saves up enough to survive the trip, and then sprints to the next city, day after day after day. When he hit 15, he threw himself into adventure, driven by one goal, to live for humanity, even as his mother tried to stop him, because doing good was the only thing that mattered to him. Back then, if a fight smelled like death, he went in swinging, acting vicious and loving every second, and even when his health started to drop, he still kept firing off his skills. But now death terrifies him. He's lost his license, crushed his pride that he fought to hold on to even when life was on the line, and still, he clings to life with everything he's got. Now he's stranded and drowning in self-pity, stumbling through the thick forest until he looks up and realizes night has already swallowed everything. And behind him, a shadow keeps creeping, but it's walking the other way. If he could break free of this cursed forest, a border checkpoint waited just ahead, but the night here bites, and he'd need to reach that gate before it's shut. A sharp stench of blood hit his nose out of nowhere, and he pushed deeper through the bushes, sprinting straight for the source. Ahead, a massive wolf-like monster hovered low to the ground, staring him down in silence, chest heaving with a painful, heavy sigh. She stared him down, never once breaking eye contact. Fenrir. 3 years after the Demon King's revival, demons and monsters had grown into a threat that could wipe out humanity itself. Even among demons, Fenrir was a freak sight, rare as a nightmare in human lands, and there he was, sprawled right before him, bleeding out so bad it screamed one thing: a hunter had finally caught him. The man strode straight toward the monster, insisting that even though he was a demon, he didn't want to slaughter it for no reason. If he could, he'd save it, but he couldn't do anything about it. Then the demon jerked upright on its front paws, snapped its gaze on him, and bared its teeth. Fear clenched the man's chest. He said he got why he was scared, but he wouldn't hurt him. Then he spotted a twisted magic circle etched into the demon's stomach, a cursed seal. And the real nightmare hit. He had no idea how he'd ended up trapped under that curse. Curses are forbidden skills meant to wreck your enemy with suffering, and every cursed seal hits differently. But the worst part, this one is a curse tied to reincarnation itself. A man is trapped inside Fenrir, and he demands answers straight up. What's this curse that turns a man into a beast? The moment he hears it, the demon's eyes start to water. He can't even wrap his head around why someone would do something like this, and at this point the reason doesn't matter. Douglas is running out of time, because if this keeps going, he's going to die. Either way, that curse has to be broken. Douglas slammed his backpack to the ground and charged straight at the monster. It was fine, he'd already broken curses over and over before. Even if he wasn't as strong as he once was, the technique and the knowledge hadn't vanished. He kept hearing the doctor's warning in his head. If he kept pushing those skills and his health hit 0, he'd die. He felt it instantly. His strength was gone, and spell to spell was brutal. One hit and his already low HP would have been finished. So yeah, this looked like the last time he'd ever save anyone as an adventurer. But think about it, this exit isn't even that bad. He promised the demon he'd finally break the spell on him, then told her to be a good girl. The monster started whining so loud the whole area heard it, but the magician snapped, "Don't be scared." What? He vowed he'd heal her, no excuses, no turning back, because doing right mattered to him, and he wasn't just trying to survive anymore. He was ready to spend his last moments living for someone else, finally choosing a worthy purpose over that endless futile drift. He started chanting for those shimmering particles and the hopes they carried, then snapped his command to dispel the spell, because he could already feel his strength draining and his health slipping away, and a sharp pain was already stabbing his body, yet he pushed through and finished the chant. And he can only pray her wounds will heal too. Then the magic slams him straight into the nearest tree, and when he finally opens his eyes, he's shocked he's still breathing, because he can't make sense of what just happened or why he's alive at all. This wasn't some dream, his seal was still blazing, real and active, and none of it made sense yet, so he ripped open his status window in a hurry. It listed him as Douglas Ford, human, unemployed, level 68 with 60,900 health and 510,432 mana. He was completely stunned by his health number, 60,900, and he swore last time it was just 2,000 red. Was his status really slipping back to the old readings? The spell finished snapping into place, but the seal held fast, and the skill bounced back and did nothing at all. It's only a guess, but it feels like that skill finally latched onto him, so he didn't just avoid dying from health loss, he rebounded right back to where his stats used to be. So yeah, he was cursed too. That made everything click, and he started blaming aging or some rare illness for his condition, until he realized it had to vanish the moment the skill bounced back into his own body. Just think, he didn't even feel the curse clamped onto him, and that's exactly why I'm calling him an idiot. It was supposed to show up as a status ailment, so why is nobody noticing it yet? And the real question is, who dared cast that curse on him? Alright, he'd deal with that later. Right now he had one job: take care of the demon. The bleeding still wouldn't quit, so he had to act fast or this was going to spiral into disaster. Because the dispel spell bounced right back off her, it means someone hit her with a forbidden spell, one of the deadliest curses out there, and only the person who cast it can undo it. So yeah, there's no way to undo this Fenrir curse and go back to being human. But think about it, if only the person who cast the spell can break it, then all he has to do is become them, right? The monster stared at him like something was off, and when he started falling behind Alan and the others, he panicked, then threw himself into studying every last skill detail he could get his hands on. If he's got that one copy ability that lets him mimic someone's voice and looks, he can use it to wear the very face of the person who cast the curse. He'd love to say that, but he has zero clue who this guy is, so he's got to dig into his memories and trade info, using the right wolf skill. Once he found out about the caster, he'll shift his appearance, strip the curse in that form, and try to make it work straight up. But at the same time, he'll have to gamble with his own skills or fall back on the second method, because only one person has ever mastered it. And that's how Alan became a real hero. His rare gift for using skills side by side made him famous overnight, so the king crowned him with the title Hero, proving just how wild that parallel skill ability really was. Now that Tony's powers are back, what do you think he feels? Pure fire, right? He has to test it, so he starts casting the Soulman Gate spell, begging it to open and fuse with him, then he fires off the memory swap. He pressed his hand to the huge demon's forehead, and bam, the girl's memories came flooding in, her terror as she fled from that strange man, while he finally glimpsed the caster's true nature and what he really looked like. Now he's gotta fill out the form, no worries. Even if he pulls out a bunch of skills, his health won't get wrecked anymore. He started the spell that sharpens the common sense hiding behind the form, then barked an order: imitate it. He slipped into the exact same man who had bewitched her, but he knew the mask wouldn't last, so he had to rush both the imitation and the dispersal, scooping up scraps of hope right then and there as he pulled the girl under his sway. The unique spell broke and violent gusts blasted the area, then just like that it faded, revealing a tiny girl sitting in front of him, a demon only recently, still so young that after she turned around, she was completely naked. He lent her your coat, and once he saw she was okay, relief hit him hard. Then he asked if her voice was still there, and she nodded yes, even if it came out slow. They just stared at each other, trapped in silence. He was totally lost because she was this quiet girl, and he had no clue how to act around kids her age in moments like that. What a start. He had to do something. He studied the magnanimous goddess's spells to become the protector of life, pouring healing magic into her until her health was fully restored. Then he leaned in and asked if she hurt anywhere. She smiled and said she was totally fine now. She ended up getting cured after all, thanks to the so-called Mr. Great Magician, so now she's totally fine, and the Great Magician turned out to be nothing more than a friendly middle-aged neighbor who'd just been calling himself that. Later, they sprawled by the fire, cooking up a meal, and the man suddenly snapped to it. He hadn't introduced himself yet. "I'm Douglas Ford," he said, then pointed at the girl, "and her name is Ravi." He asked if she still remembered the city she called home, then said he'd walk her to her place at dawn, but she stayed quiet for a beat before admitting she had nowhere left to go. He pressed, asking why and what happened to her family. It turns out she didn't have a family either, so she's been stranded with no one just like that. Still, there had to be somewhere she called home before the curse. The girl let out a full-body scream, swearing she didn't want to be dragged back anywhere ever again. He stared in shock because she was terrified, like what in the world just happened to her. If she didn't want it, he wouldn't drag her there. He'd made a promise, but now he was completely thrown off and didn't understand a thing. She's got her reasons, and dumping her in the nearest town would be a disaster, but hey, he knows a few people, so it's not all bad. He even warned it's a bit of a trek because they're headed for a town called Baltsac. He'll track down someone who can take care of her there, even if it's going to be a long haul. She asked if that would be hard for him to handle, and he said, "Of course not," flashing a warm smile at her. The food was finally done, but one last dish still sat unfinished on the table. Then the girl tried to speak, yet the man didn't catch it, so he called out again, only for her to whip her head away in embarrassment and shut down completely. The man sliced the apples on the board into thin slices, fried them one by one until both sides turned soft and tender, then handed them to the girl with a warm wish for a pleasant appetite. For dinner, they served bread with apples and steaming pork soup, sweet-smelling, but way too hot to touch, so she had to be careful. Then she took a bite of what they offered, and the second it hit, she lit up and swung her legs with pure joy. He was thrilled she was thrilled, because that fire kicked up this weird, bittersweet combo of apples and dry bread, and if you've got dried pork, you can also boil it into a rich dashi broth. Cook it until the meat starts sweating fat and turns tender, because the taste is unreal. Robbie was trembling like crazy, and the man demanded what was wrong with her. Did she hate it, or was something hurting her? Turns out the whole reason was simple. Everything about it felt unreal. She burst into tears and thanked him for saving her, and in that moment he finally found what he wanted, to live for someone and keep doing good. But somehow they saved a middle-aged man and a mysterious girl named Ravi, and if he really wants her safe, he'll have to tell her the truth, because their brief, unbelievable journey kicks off from right here. Ravi was sprawled on the ground on top of bedclothes when she finally blinked awake, right as the man noticed and shot her a bright good morning, asking if she'd slept well. She apologized instantly because she'd fallen asleep while he was watching over her. But he had no clue what she was talking about. People always say kids grow while they sleep, and she swears she needs that. But right before the move, they had to do one thing. He stitched homemade shoes for the girl out of bags. She stared in shock as those bags turned into shoes, and when he confessed he'd just tied them up with string, looking a little rough at first, she bit back her doubts and waited it out, smiled anyway, and told him, "No way, I'll take care of them," then thanked him like he'd done magic. She's a real good girl. Now that the prep's done, it's time to move out. He shouted for Ravi, who was sitting with his back to him, and then he learned she'd spotted something on the ground, shining, shimmering, like it was calling them closer. He asked if she remembered anything about the necklace, and she just shook her head blank. Then he couldn't believe it. Something this important could have been buried out there, lost so deep in the mountains. Once those special devices click on, spells and magical skills hit harder than ever, and there's a very real chance they used it to curse Ravi. He thrust it into her hands, daring her to try it on, because the curse was already shattered, so she'd be perfectly safe wearing it. But she refused, since keeping it would mean selling it back in town, so for now, he kept it. It wasn't a long ride at all. Good company kept them laughing as they rolled into the kingdom's northern lands. Baltsac's metropolis sat in the southwest, so now they're heading south. Here, the whole region is still wild and untouched, no roads cut through it yet, just endless forest. Only traveling merchants dare to move through, and not a single carriage ever rolls along the main roads. He thought staying silent would kill the vibe, so he talked up a storm on the way, clumsy with words, sure, but Ravi leaned in and listened like every word mattered, clearly loving the tales from his past travels. They've barely met, yet something feels off in him, like he's not the same guy who used to drift around the world with no direction. Sure, people say there's no long road with good company, but trust me, having someone beside you makes it feel better. After what felt like no time at all, they were already there. McFadden, a tiny village in the north with a hotel tucked together with a little shop and a church, and he'd even slept there the night before. He barged into the building and greeted the owner, then asked for 2 full sets of clothes, shoes, and underwear for the girl, plus soup and towels, and the owner told him to step inside and wait while she scrambled to get everything ready. Even though she was his daughter, he clammed up and said nothing, while she held out shoes stitched from wood and leather, asking which pair they wanted. Then the man demanded the only thing that mattered. Which ones wouldn't hurt if you wore them all day? Wooden ones felt way more comfortable, plus they block moisture and stand up to water and cold better than leather, so she figured they'd be perfect for her, and since kids grow fast, she grabbed underwear one size bigger. Then she asked if they needed anything else, while the man begged to see the leather flask, only for it to be sold out, so he swore he'd hunt for it in the nearest town. An old man eavesdropped on their talk, leaned in, and demanded whether they were headed for Addington, then grinned and said his little shop was there, so they could meet up. He usually sizes up every item people bring him using his skills, but he can't stand being stuck in his shop all day, so he dumps the shop work on his son and heads out to trade in small things. He was itching to get the appraisal started, so he slapped down the necklace they'd just found and asked what it might bring. Then the old man nudged his glasses up and said it looked like a real antique. He needs just 1 second to fire up his appraisal skills, because the mistress basically snubs Grandpa Theo's abilities, saying he doesn't need them at all, and then they lean in to inspect the necklace through the lens. It was a black pearl, and the woman figured the market would pay around 20 silver for it, plus, if they wanted, she could sell it right to them. 20 silver might not sound huge, but it was still a solid deal, enough to cover a whole month of food. That black pearl was a steal, until I learned it had already been used for a forbidden spell, because gemstones don't just glow, they unleash way stronger magic than ordinary magic, so yeah, this is almost definitely no ordinary black pearl. It turned out to be a black obsidian pearl, same name, same shape, but the price is in a whole different universe, because this rare prize is only pulled from the eyes of a black tiger shrimp. The woman gasped at what sat before her, a black tiger shrimp's eye. Then the old man snapped that she couldn't afford it, not with 0 skills, and she realized she couldn't even quote a normal price for it. Douglas shot to his feet, started chanting, and begged the Almighty God to flip open the Book of Knowledge, then poured out the kind of wisdom an appraising judge would use, because he'd learned it for sure. The thing looked exactly like a black obsidian pearl. The woman and the old man reeled in pure shock, screaming at the top of their lungs, demanding to know if he could use the appraisal skill, while the old man swore they were travelers, only to realize they were merchants. He hurried to insist they were just plain wanderers, but the moment they saw his moves, it was obvious. He wasn't ordinary at all. The women were yelling about it, and the wild part is he wasn't even a merchant. Grandpa said that top-tier adventurers could nab serious skills, but if that's true, then he's basically proof he's a high-level skill user too. But the hero snapped back that, honestly, if you're talking about it, he wasn't some amazing adventurer. Sure, he had appraisal skills and knew the prices, but he still apologized, because he figured his answers might have made everything feel awkward. The old man burst out laughing, confessing he'd been totally bamboozled by his own modesty, and the landlady shot back that, even if he wasn't a merchant, his sharp eye for judging people was so spot on it was practically like having a brother in the business. Right then they didn't have much to spare, but if he slipped into the old man's shop in Addington, he'd grab it for at least market value. The old man introduced himself as Theo, and he told him he'd be counting the days until they met again. Later they ducked into a new shop, and the owner greeted them with a bright smile. Then her eyes lit up because she remembered him from just a bit ago and asked if he'd be staying the night, and yeah, when she looked at him, it was clear something big had really gone down. The woman spotted the little girl and demanded, "Who are you?" snapping that she wasn't there last time, and the man froze, clueless on what he could even say. The woman stared at him like something was off and told him he didn't look like a kidnapper, so she wasn't about to stick her nose into trouble that wasn't hers. But if that kid ever climbed onto this bed, she'd treat it the same as an adult, no exceptions, and the man nodded along. The girl's filthy, and the mistress won't let her step inside like that, so she grabs the tub and hauls it out back to scrub her clean before she enters the house. The man hauled a bucket of water, and now that he could finally use his skills, he didn't have to run himself ragged just to grab it. He could ration the effort and keep it lean. He begged the Holy Spirit of water, hunting for love in lonely hearts, to bless him with Undine's water magic, and when he reached Karita, the girl scrubbing her clothes, massive magic spheres started raining into the air. She stared at the picture in pure awe because it wasn't just amazement, it was proof that he could finally use his powers again, the way he used to, and he never truly understood what that meant until it hit him recently. He fired off a question to Robbie about what was wrong, and she snapped back that, scratch that, she'd spotted something tucked right beside the necklace, but she'd begged herself not to tell him yet. Then she asked if she could sell it too, because yeah, it was a gorgeous ring. He remembered it all when he was a kid. Alan's parents were cut down right before his eyes, and rage screamed for revenge. He swore on the ring his mother left him, and that's the exact oath he'd told him back when he first showed that same ring before. It couldn't be a mistake. The dragon ruby felt like a piece of his parents' past, and he'd cherished that memory. But he didn't remember them handing over anything, and he definitely didn't recall trusting him with the ring, so there was no way it just ended up in his luggage. Then how the heck was it found out in the mountains? Even though he already knows the truth, he refuses to accept it, still clinging to denial. After a nasty smack from spell to spell, he bursts back with his old strength, and the cursed accessory stays right there near Ravi and the ring because Alan is the one who cursed him. Alan is fucking creepy as hell, and the scary part is why he jumped in for him. Then it all spirals into losing his license and just sitting there, waiting to die, because the one man he called his comrade had basically sealed his fate. While he was still thinking, the magic snapped apart. Those water drops exploded into full-on rain, smashing down and soaking Ravi and the man standing beside her, and he couldn't even wrap his head around why he'd made him so furious. Nothing in his mind even clicked. Turns out that's exactly what happened. He must have been so indifferent he didn't even realize someone has been insulted. Raffi crumpled onto the ground, drenched to the bone, and asked him what the hell was wrong, but that guy brushed it off and tried to sell her the lie that none of it was a big deal. To her, it didn't seem like anything, until his face betrayed the pain, and he admitted it wasn't a lie anymore, because Ravi had always been sharp enough to see through pretending. He dropped to the ground and told Ravi to listen. This ring she'd found wasn't just random. It used to be treasured by one of his old comrades, so they weren't selling it. They were bringing it back to its rightful owner, and he would finally uncover why that person had hidden it away. The owner marched out into the yard and snapped, furious, why the hell both of them were sitting there soaking wet, so she decided she'd bathe the kid herself, and he'd better go clean himself up. The guy insisted he could handle it alone, but the woman shut that down fast. You need respect, and you don't get to treat me like I'm nothing. He finally understood he'd messed up, then backed off and walked away. He figured it was normal to ignore all that stuff since she was still just a kid, even if she was a stranger, but she nailed at least one thing. The man shaved his beard with a knife, and he had no clue what he was doing. Someone yelled from behind and snapped his attention to her. Turns out it was the owner, already there with the washed kid, grilling him about Robbie's freshly trimmed bangs. They were too long, so she cut them shorter right there with permission. The girl looked thrilled, and the hostess waved him over like, say it. He couldn't believe how kind she was for a kid. They'd already stepped inside, slid into their seats, and the hostess started bringing dish after dish to the table. She said it was fine, but the questions kept burning in her head. Why did he come back to a village like this again? Didn't he go on a journey to pick up his daughter? She asked Ravi because honestly, traveling with her dad should have been amazing. But the girl, once she heard them talk about her father, crumbled inside, staring down at her plate, remembering what she'd said earlier about having no family, and the tears begged the truth. She must be aching for him, or maybe he'd already vanished into the next world. He hasn't dared get curious or question her yet because he's sure she doesn't want to dig into that topic. Plus, even if they split up, they're still going to be stuck traveling through Baltsac for months. So yeah, it'd be a pretty lonely story because they're total strangers, and he doesn't even realize how much space he has to keep between them, yet he figures everything will be fine as long as he closes the gap, step by step. He stared at the coins crammed in his palm. This was all he had left, and he knew he'd have to snag a real, permanent job soon, while the child smiled and chowed down, thanking him because the food was downright delicious. He stared, shocked by how fast she devoured her food, then realized she'd need to rest and head to the hotel, so he called the girl by the window. She turned and spotted a massive house sitting at the very end of the settlement. 5 days had slammed by since they left McFadden village for the south, and now he and Robbie finally rolled into Addington, the charity town where Theo's grandfather's shop sat on softly rolling land. On the high ground above the northern shore sits the Matlock Orphanage, and in big cities you'll always find orphanages, but most of them are drowning in cash problems. So basically none of them come close to this place's elegance, and that's why the city's shelters still look decent. Then the owner stepped up and asked them straight out, "So, you guys travelers?" She noticed their eyes snag on the building and lit up, calling it a wonderful orphanage. Turns out the director had once crushed it in trade and was now pouring his money into giving orphans a real education. Honestly, the way people try to judge him is just wild, and yeah, this is the 4th time he's heard a story like this. The crazy part is, no matter where he goes, his reputation only gets praise, never backlash. I think he should make sure Ravi doesn't feel like he's being controlled, because they charged down the street past the rattling carriages, and the man could tell she was watching them closely. He asked her if she'd ever ridden them, but she had never gotten the chance. If they pushed a little farther south, they'd spot stagecoaches, multi-seat horse-drawn carriages that hauled people and mail, and sooner or later, he promised, he'd give her a ride. Now he can't stop catching her smiling, and he's convinced it's those short bangs drawing everyone in, like when he watched the man stride out and the kids nearby rush up to thank the principal for sweets, only for him to wave it off and warn, "Don't get careless, watch your steps." What? He locked his eyes on this man. Could he be the director of the city orphanage? And were these kids nearby dressed like they belonged to nobility? Compared to theirs, Ravi's new clothes looked way too plain. He stared at the girl, and her face was nothing like the bright smile she'd had earlier when she heard about the carriages. The way she stared like she was craving something, screamed jealousy, and those cute outfits were probably driving her mad, too. Right then, the kids who'd just been chatting with the principal came sprinting at her, and the man barked at her. The girls came sprinting straight at her, then their feet tangled and they toppled backward. The principal and Douglas lunged and caught their kids just in time, and somehow everything ended up okay. Douglas snapped his gaze to Ravi, checking if she was really all right. Then he pivoted to the director, demanding answers about his kid's condition, and turned to the magician to ask for forgiveness, speaking on behalf of the children. The hero admitted he wasn't watching either and told Raffi to try standing up now. Then the announcer spotted them and snapped that he should apologize, because it turned out he jumped to the wild conclusion that they were father and daughter. But here's the crazy part, he couldn't figure out how he knew what he knew. The reason, the distance between them had never really closed, and even when he reached out his hand, that girl hesitated like she couldn't trust the moment. If they were really father and daughter, this would have never spiraled like that. Everything made sense, until the director leaned in and demanded to know what kind of relationship they had. Douglas feared everyone would suddenly suspect him of kidnapping children, then he insisted they were just a father and daughter, purely out of duty, and that it was only recently. The announcer swore this was the moment his whole life snapped into a new shape, and the hero just grumbled that he'd already got enough problems as it was. He'd dealt with it, so the director pressed him. Then what worries are you talking about? There's no way he's really flirting with a kid who isn't even related to him. Then the hero finally clocked it. He'd just talked himself into a disaster. Then the director blurted out exactly what he thought. Sure, it was way out of line, but it felt like those two were already in real trouble. He runs the orphanage in Matlock, and he just wanted to offer him some advice, if he didn't mind. Trying to take care of that little girl is brutal. Traveling with a child cages how far he can go, and he can't just tune her out while she sleeps either, so yeah, he's been on real guard duty since last night. And he's certain they're drowning in expenses way more than when he was alone. He's got a whole mess of kids on his shoulders, left to him through one disaster after another. The man catches the hint, but he won't go along with it, so he pushes the idea that Ravi should be dropped off in an orphanage instead. Why did the talk explode like that? He yelled that he was grateful for their offer, then snatched the girl and bolted, and the director, watching from the side, went totally silent in shock. They finally burst into the hotel, and the girl dropped onto the edge of the bed in total silence, because ever since they'd come back, Ravi wasn't herself anymore. She just stared at those clothes, said nothing, and kept comparing her outfit to the kids from the orphanage. Douglas sprinted right up to her, grabbed her shirt, and blurted, "Is it expensive?" The man scratched his face, admitted it was cheap, and begged for forgiveness, shame burning on him like a spotlight. But the girl just smiled and said she was relieved it was. Ravi couldn't figure out why she was smiling. Was she stressed about something else, thinking about him, or was that joy just envy wearing a pretty face? He nearly forgot he'd run off on the director's nudge, but then he couldn't stop wondering what Ravi was thinking. Surely there were plenty of kids her age around, and she could get by without any real discomfort. No way this could be real. Could Ravi actually want to go to the orphanage? Didn't he ask her that exact thing? If it was true, then he'd be apologizing to her for refusing the director on the spot without thinking, and the girl just stared back, totally stunned. She could have told him, but he decided to corner him tomorrow and find out what she really felt. Yet when he tried, she shook her head, shut the conversation down, and made it clear there was no point asking again. Then she threw it away. He exhaled in pure relief, yanked the door open, told her, "I'll be right back, stay here," then vanished out the exit. It felt like a weight off his chest, because she didn't look like she wanted to run to a shelter, but if she ended up going, he swore he'd dress her up so nicely it would make the whole place look better. If she keeps acting like this, they'll go anywhere and she'll still end up miserable. Yeah, even he only squeezed out a small gift, but he's praying she can at least smile because of it. He burst into the hotel, tossed out an apology for the past, but the girl was gone, no trace. On the table, a note sat waiting, and he snatched it up, asking what it meant. The words inside read like a victory. The girl thanked him for everything, and right after that he found her, happy, standing right there beside him. But she headed for the shelter, and the man shot straight for the door, because he had zero clue how to raise kids, and the second he thought about Ravi, he was already planning to palm him off to one of his friends. If all he wanted was a life with zero hassle, then the place wouldn't matter at all. He told Ravi he just needed to know how she felt, but the moment she answered, he deliberately refused to look at her and sprinted off like he couldn't breathe. He knew he never should have followed her, then it all snapped into place. The gift he'd bought had already slipped out of his hands and hit the floor, and it was ruined. A little later, he rushed into Theo's department store. He stared through the glass door as his son demanded the father hand over the inventory to him, claiming he'd outgrown it because he was too old. while the old man he already knew shot back that his son wasn't the weak one at all. The hero pushed into the shop, and before he even finished stepping in, the old man greeted him like he'd been waiting all day, eyes finally lighting up as he asked, "So you came after all to return that necklace?" But right then, the real trouble hit. That necklace once belonged to a kid he used to run with, so he plans to return it later. He's genuinely sorry, but deep down he knows he'll never be able to sell it to the old man. Theo didn't get where this was headed, so he shut the topic down on the spot, because he cared more about what happened to the girl who owned that necklace, and the man finally explained what went down during all that time. After the merchant's son heard every bit of the story, he grinned and said it was amazing. He was certain the girl was incredibly lucky, and that happiness was finally waiting for her. The man finally got it. Theo was right. He didn't like him, and the son chimed in too, snapping that his father was back at it again, telling the hero to ignore him. His father is basically the only one in town trashing the director's name, and he swears that hiring her was an absolute win, because even while they're hunting for adoptive parents, she'll reject anyone who isn't a nobleman. And yeah, you've already got plenty of kids who have left her nest. This city already feels so comfy to live in, and yet they're still leaving. Kinda weird, right? I mean, it's a massive metropolis here, but aren't they saying the eastern continent is a whole different beast? He has to understand if he heads southeast from here, he'll hit the port and then he can cross the ocean. So when that man asked about crossing the ocean, he was really wondering if he meant Shipton, the port town. But Shipton only lets in tiny short-range fishing boats and merchant ships, no passengers. And since he's tangled with the guild more than once, he's sure it's been years since a passenger ship has dared to dock here. 10 years ago, the eastern continent got hammered by the Demon King's ruthless invasions, and the demon's cruelty never let up. That's the tale they told him as he headed east from Shipton to wipe them out, and he remembers every brutal detail. But when the director came back on a merchant ship with his buddies, he'd suddenly racked up so much power that he could call a ship anytime. So yeah, the man was terrified because there was no way out. Alan's crew probably grabbed the eastern continent for now, but this city is getting slammed with danger again fast. And look at this merchant, he has no clue about the Demon King's invasions. So what gives? Are they quietly sending the kids away while the director stays in the dark? But every time the one who's delivering the kids shows up at the eastern port, they arrive safe and sound, unless the director knows, in which case they're just being hidden. So what in the world is the real reason behind it? He couldn't just abandon Ravi there, so he blurted an apology, sprinted out of the shop, and when the old man's son shot him a sudden question, he snapped back that he was heading out to bring Ravi back. A little later, as he sprinted up to the shelter, he slammed his fist on the door, panting hard from that long run. The door swung open, and the director was right there, staring at the same familiar man as he demanded to know what he wanted. The man shot back that he'd come to pick up Ravi, and the director just couldn't wrap his head around it. Didn't Ravi want to come here on her own? He knew she'd told him all about it the day before, and in his mind, it was nothing more than a misunderstanding. He grabs Ravi and heads to find her, saying he's sure she's in the garden with the other kids and he'll lead the way. When they reach it, the place is packed with children, and the hero spin around, scanning everywhere, desperately hunting for Ravi. Spying her, he blurted her name and sprinted over, saying he'd come for her and they could finally go home. She lit up at first, ready to reach out, until something stopped her cold. The girl shot back that staying with him would spell trouble, so she wanted to stay right here. Then it hit him, like a flashback to when the principal warned him it would be tough to care for a little girl. Traveling with a baby slashes how far he can go, and he can't just zone out while the kid sleeps, because deep down he's convinced the baby is still watching like it's on guard. He was so lost in his own head that he totally blanked on Ravi. Ravi was standing right there, listening to every word behind his back, and the kicker was, he was convinced they'd have even more expenses than when they were on their own. She heard that too. With her calm, reserved vibe, he should have clocked her feelings, but he missed it again and again, because deep down she kept believing her very presence would crush his life, and only now did it finally hit him. He dropped to his knees and begged her for forgiveness, admitting he'd botched everything by ignoring her feelings and storming out after misunderstanding her, and then he just sat there waiting. When it was all said and done, she told him there was no need to apologize at all. But it never even crossed his mind that Ravi could become a burden to him. No, he'd be glad to have her along for the ride. So he asked her again, straight up, if she wanted to come back to him. The girl gripped her clothes with trembling palms and begged, "Am I really not a burden?" And the second he said no, she lunged into his arms like she couldn't bear to let go. She refused to leave, then burst into hard, shaky tears as she clung to him. The director strode up, clapped her hands, and gushed that it was wonderful, so much that he nearly broke down in tears. He wanted to help so many people, but he couldn't hold her back now that she was determined to leave, so he stepped in to see her off. Before he took off, the man blurted that he needed to ask Principal Matlock one thing. He'd heard every kid from the orphanage was about to be shipped to the eastern continent, but wait, wasn't that supposed to mean crossing the ocean first? The director himself confirmed it, so he sometimes sees them off, then heads to the eastern continent to check firsthand. He can't visit often, but the last time he went was a full year ago. Douglas leaned in and asked what he thought. Come on, the place must be great, right? The director beamed and insisted it was buzzing with life, day after day, with a festive vibe in the air, and the kids who just moved and looked thrilled. Turns out back then he hadn't been fooled at all. 3 brutal years had already gone by since the eastern continent was once again crushed by the 4 heavenly lords and the demon lord. They've even got control of the industrial city of Bourbon, and yet, he swears it looked like they were unbelievably happy living there. Most travelers can't even reach that place, and if someone somehow slips into the city by sheer luck, they're trapped there for good, no way out. The director yanks his handkerchief across his sweating face, warns everyone to keep the voice down because it just can't be said, and swears he saw everything firsthand. Then Douglas shoots back, "Yeah, I saw it too, like that's what makes it so damn strange." The director shouted for the kids to step into the house for a bit, and every single one of them obeyed without a fight, like he had something planned. He even hinted he might have to pull them back out if things got messy, and honestly, none of them understood a word he meant. Then he started in about his favorite product, like that was the point. Meanwhile, he'd have to kill him anyway. He snapped his hand forward and fighters poured in from every side, weapons drawn. Turns out they were the shelter's workers too, all involved. But as he kept Ravi hidden behind him, he leaned close and ordered her to remember. No matter what hits them, he'll shield her with his life. Right then, the director snapped an order to murder the man carrying the child, and the hero immediately started reading his spell, begging the goddess guardian of the sacred land to seal the moment with a horrifying kiss. Hell's ice magic, he slammed the ground, and in an instant everything around him turned to ice, even the people nearby getting frozen, and the director finally snapped. This guy wasn't defense at all, he was an offensive skill user. Douglas told Ravi to wait at the spot, then stormed to the director and demanded answers. Where were the kids who vanished from the orphanage? The director shrugged, claiming he had no idea, and that magician. He could freeze his own body solid and deliver a lethal, icy death in an instant. The director's scream tore through the room. Was this madman really threatening him? He probably was just bluffing. That face didn't look like it could back up murder. But right then, the magician's smile turned sinister, and it was downright terrifying. Turns out he just straight up copied the director's face, and yeah, he absolutely shouldn't have. He didn't even care about confessing, not with everyone else here, like they already knew what was coming. Once the director bit the dust, he planned to interrogate them all. Finally, he snapped and confessed, admitting he'd sold some kids from a perverted noble house to strange places, and the man demanded, what kind of places were they? Right then, the director shrieked at the top of his lungs, yelling for the military police to come help, insisting that a filthy old man was about to kill him, while everyone around him, and even Matlock, froze and asked what on earth was wrong. The director was cocky as hell. He knew the hero had dropped his guard, and he still had one trump card. He called down the holy spirit of flame, the salamander's deadly fire magic. The hero spotted the projectile streaking toward him, and his eyes popped wide with panic, because once the director whisked him away, the truth would vanish, and no one in this city would ever believe a wanderer like him. And tomorrow, that director stays right where he is, while the hero snaps his hand up in front of the projectile and slams it aside. The director's face twists with shock. He yells for them to wait, then blurts an apology, admitting it was all his fault. Right then, wham, his face gets punched, and the hero can't wait even a second. Ravi bolts up and asks, "Daddy, are you okay?" He says, "I'm fine," and only after that does it finally hit him why she called him. Then the military police come sprinting in, yelling for the director. They heard a scream just now, and when they looked up, they saw the director slumped unconscious, and the others were frozen in the ice too. They tried to speak up, but the moment they noticed the girl clinging to the man, they choked the words back and went silent. They begged to have it laid out, every detail of what happened. And then, after pulling up a list of clients from the director's room, they somehow talked the military police into trusting their version of events. They're hunting down every trafficked child by any means they can, and it's not just talk. They've confirmed his intentions, and it looks like he's about to bring them all home. Everyone in the city couldn't believe it. Desmond had tricked them all, and now it's volunteers stepping up, taking turns to care for the kids at the shelter. The only thing keeping them alive is the kindness of the people in this city, so they rushed back to the hotel, and the girl tore open the gift box she'd gotten, staring at it like it meant everything. Then she asked what happened to it, and you could see it was smashed and crumpled beyond repair. He said it was meant to be her gift, but when she questioned the box, it somehow wasn't the same anymore. She opened it and gasped at the gorgeous bow inside, while he'd already grabbed it on his way out and left her sitting there alone. Ashamed that she was stuck in cheap clothes, he suddenly froze up and acted weird. Then when she apologized for being left alone, asked if she could wear it, he didn't hesitate. "I'll put it on for you myself." He lifted the bow, slid it into her hair, and grinned. "It fits you perfectly." She blinked and asked why he'd picked it for her, only to realize he'd actually bought it for someone else back when he met kids from an orphanage. Those charming little dresses lit a spark of envy in her, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. The girl blushed and snapped, "No way, I'm not staring at the dresses." She pointed straight at the sweets instead. Then it clicked for the guy, and he burst out laughing. With anger, despair, and heartbreak swirling in the air, even a joyful get-together can smash those feelings and help people push through. Yet he, the loner, still has a lot to learn about what it really means to be a father. The night still had plenty left, so they stepped out to soak in the moonlight together, and yeah, so far everything was going perfectly. Because of what happened with Director Matlock, the military police told them to stay put in this city, so they're probably stuck in Addington for the next 4 or 5 days, and right now they're huddled at a tavern table, digging into their food. He's about to snag some part-time work to stash cash for the trip, but I can't stop thinking, what's Ravi going to do? Will she actually be waiting for him back at the hotel? But she wants to stay with him, yet if it's work, she probably can't, so he pushes the idea, "Let's go together." She fires back, "Are you sure it's possible, and won't I just get in your way?" He denied it flat out, and the truth was simple. No place would ever be safer than standing right beside him, so he could protect her as best he could, but now that it had come to this, he had a proposal ready for her. From now on, no matter where they go, he insists they stick to the father-daughter bond, because he refuses to let something like what happened the other day ever repeat. From this moment on, he'd introduce Ravi as his daughter right in front of everyone, and demand that she call him Daddy, too. The second those words landed, embarrassment hit her face like a wave. She asked, "Is everything okay?" And when she tried to back out, he just shrugged it off, like it was fine either way. But the truth was louder than her words. She didn't even know if she could really call him that. Then he flashed a grin and said, "Yes, you can," and dared her to try calling him that right now. She blurted "Dad" with a blush so deep it felt like it burned. Then the man's face cracked with the same awkward shock, and even though she thought it sounded weird, he didn't correct her, just stood there painfully tense, and now they've got a quest to take on. 2 days later, on the day of the quest, they trekked through the forest with the child. He asked Ravi if she was cold, but she said she was fine. The adventurer up ahead snapped his tongue, then spun back and barked at him, asking if taking on a job with a child meant he was looking down on them. If this was only supposed to be a stroll, then it's time to head home. The magician smirked and promised, "I won't cause you a bit of trouble." He finally clocked it. This guy was the commander of the self-defense forces they were riding with, and he radiated pure menace, the total opposite of his own vibe, because this time the locals didn't ask for help with rumors or chores. They wanted them to subdue a red-eyed dragon. The Adventurers Guild usually sticks you with quests tied to personal problems, so the rewards and difficulty stay pretty mild, until you dodge the guild and take jobs that the city or the country hands you straight from the top. Sometimes you can even snag them without a license, but it wrecks you with extra complexity. And red-eyed dragons, those monstrous magical beasts, are pure fury, terrifyingly aggressive, their favorite snack, humans. Every year they crawl out of hibernation and race up into the mountains to build nests by human settlements, so Addington's people have been wiping out dragons for years. Halfway through the trip, they called it and stopped for lunch. The man and the child sat off to the side, away from everyone, while the girl dug into her sandwiches and grinned at how light the eggs tasted. She swore they were delicious, and he couldn't help but feel relieved hearing it. This morning he cooked everything himself in the hotel kitchen, then rolled out egg sandwiches and beef meatball soup like a full-on feast. A guy sitting off to the side, head wrapped in bandages, slid up to them and demanded to know what they were eating. Meatball soup, really. Word shot back to the others who were farther off, and once they heard meatballs, they instantly figured out that mouth-watering smell. That hot soup would thaw even the coldest bones. Douglas was pretty sure they still had some left, so he turned to Robbie and asked what she thought, and she just nodded right away. The magician told the others, "If you want, eat, there's not much left, so you'll have to share one pot," and he swore it would still take the chill off them. Then the man shot back, "Are you really sure?" They might have liked the fact that he had that bad attitude toward the two of them, but he just grinned and told them not to worry. After all, when you team up with strangers, you stay on guard. The others rubbed the backs of their necks, mortified, but if he said it, they shrugged it off, because to them he looked like a genuinely good guy. The first one who stepped forward grabbed a sip of soup from a glass, lit up, and declared it was delicious, saying he'd never tasted anything better. They demanded to know what kind of meat he packed in there, but he started to speak, then whipped around and caught the same bearded troublemaker from the road, the one who'd yelled at him. The guy beside him snapped, "If you're still thinking about that bearded idiot, it's not worth it. Drop it and leave him alone." They threw the name Noyash at him, furious over what he just said. The young man asked, "Why don't you guys go talk to him?" But they shut him down. They said he was steering the group anyway, so messing things up would only be pointless. Then the magician decided to step right up to the man and tell him, "You're going to freeze out here, so come on, why not grab a bowl of soup with us?" What? That guy just stared at him with pure rage, and then he went off again, shouting, "Why are you all pestering me with food?" He snapped that they'd already forgotten why they were even here, and if they were done eating, then it was time to perform. Those words sent chills through everyone's bones, and they scrambled to gear up for the next leg of the journey. Beardman stepped forward, Noish fumed beside Ravi, while Douglas, baby strapped to his back, trailed behind the whole crew. Suddenly one of the adventurers shouted for everyone to gather. Then they spotted massive animal tracks, huge enough to make every step feel terrifying. Those red-eyed dragons love nothing more than snatching other species' nests, and judging by these tracks, one of them has probably been building its own nest right at the end. Guess they caught a break this year, because for creatures that huge, they're getting away with it. Everyone nodded along, and Douglas even spotted fresh tracks. Then the others panicked to rush, but the magician snapped, "Forget this path and move on." Every head snapped to him in total confusion, and there he sat on the ground, demanding everyone check the other tracks. The bearded man shot back that those marks were only from a deer or a boar, and if he kept pushing, he'd send him flying. He said, "If it's a deer, you won't see any hoof prints, but if it's a boar, there'll be plenty of tracks," then pointed out that the front part's shape matched the main hoof, showing it belonged to a rounded-footed creature. That's the tell these tracks are the work of the mythical beast unicorn. And the second people spotted it, the whole crowd erupted in screams, because once the mythical beast shows up, you're almost never lucky enough to see it again. But then why can't they just take that route? They swear unicorns are super skittish, and if you keep your distance, they won't lash out at people. But it wasn't the unicorn that was the problem, it was the panic. He should have been careful, yet he froze, panicked, and totally forgot to wipe out his tracks, leaving them with only one grim possibility. It all starts when they bolt from this monster so massive it chomps mythical beasts like snacks, and they've never even heard of a thing like it, all because they don't know what they're up against. I know it sounds wild, but today he demands they all go back, because he's sure they'll be crushed when some massive, unknown monster comes for them. Even in those super rare cases, death still loomed, because if they took serious damage, it would be over way too fast, while the bearded man kept screaming that his chatter was driving him insane, and they needed to get it under control. So are they really that clueless? Douglas only got here because he's a coward. He won't face this alone, so now he's trying to drag everyone with him. He pressed forward, barking that any girl desperate to bolt could just go. He'd have nothing to do with cowards, while the others yelled at them to hold up and come after him. The kid with the bandaged head blurted, "I'm sorry," knowing Dad and the daughter would be left alone, but they still had to go back. Then the magician snapped, "You're coming too," swearing he'd never abandon them like that. The young guy admitted he was a father too, but nothing like that bearded leader. Douglas even pressed him, asking if the other guys hanging with the leader were his sons or his fathers. But he's not their real father. This bearded man has never been married, yet the other guys still owe him big time because he saved their lives, so even with fear in their guts, they'll fall in behind him like he's the only dad they've got. Even after years in the self-defense forces, he still can't stand that guy, not even a little, and he's convinced he can already resign because that's how it's always been. Noosh might have clocked that this leader's arrogance makes him a nightmare to deal with, but the moment he says the leader is like a father to them, everything suddenly changes. He gets it now because for the first time he's got something to protect too. And yeah, I'm sure this leader isn't malicious, he's just worried. He even followed Noyesh, telling him today was the first time he'd ever met their leader, but from the way he carries himself, the guy just seems clumsier than the others. Even during lunch, he stared out like he was the only one seeing what lurked out there, and the moment he shouted danger, he was the first to bolt straight into the mountains. He might look terrifying, but he's trying to make them understand. He doesn't hate them all. He did it because he didn't want any of those guys getting hurt. If that's the case, Noishu's just dead weight, couldn't even suffer. So he grilled his uncle, asking, "Is it the same girl?" He tried to explain, but the magician totally missed the point. Then from the side, voices crackled in, and something shifted in the air. They sprinted straight at them, soldiers trembling, begging, "What happened?" Douglas hurried over, gently shut the rabbi's eyes, and told him, "Don't look." Then it hit them. The ground was littered with piles of red-eyed dragon remains. Blood pools so thick it looks like the dragons were chewed up and gone, yet red-eyed dragons are monsters with a higher, more twisted rank, so what if something even worse slipped in and started hunting them? Yeah, he's right, things like that would hang around a city with no dungeon anywhere nearby, and that's what makes it so insanely weird. This red coal won't just burn, it'll smother the scent, and those blood-stains scream that a tail is close. Then it hits him. In the sky, a colossal monster is barreling toward them, a dragon blazing from its mouth. A demonic black dragon dropped out of nowhere, an SS-rank dragon king that could wipe a whole village in an hour, and it was mowing down red-eyed dragons like they were nothing. The adventurers froze in panic, because beating a monster like that felt completely hopeless. They surged forward screaming as they bolted, only to get chased because that demonic black dragon goes after the ones who flee first. They tried to stop them, yelling for them to quit running, hide instead. The dragon roared so loud they never even heard him, then it struck, jaws snapping at everyone. The hero hurled out of the way and shot Ravi a frantic question, "Are you and the others who got hit okay?" They sprawled on the ground but weren't done for, because the bearded man had parried enough of the hit to save them. He snapped, asking if everyone was okay, and when they said yes, they hauled back and finally let go of their luggage. Douglas spotted the chief's wounded leg and blurted it out, but the bearded man snapped that there wasn't a second to talk, so nobody even looked at the injury. The bearded man declared he'd be bait and shouted the others to bolt, but Noyash begged him to stop. It was insane, and besides, you can't outrun a dragon on foot, not with wounds like his. Douglas would never throw him into the grave, so he grabbed Robbie, told him to hold on tight, and started chanting that acceleration spell, roaring for it to ignite at full power, explosive fast. Robbie screamed as speed ripped him apart. Everyone's jaw dropped at how fast the magic surged. Was this ancient old man really a magician on a level nobody could even comprehend? Noyesh clenched his teeth. As he closed in on the bearded man, he saw the dragon winding up to blast fire, so he snapped, "Jump right now," and the bearded man actually listened. He couldn't peel his eyes off his prey. He snapped the spell again, begging the ascending flight to blaze at full power. Then, the instant the dragon spat out fire, he launched himself straight into the sky. He dodged the black demonic dragon's strike, and now he has to hunt its throat, the soft scales underneath, but that spot is brutal to reach. If he hangs in the air right there, the dragon will tag him before he can land it. A young guy with a bandage sprinted toward them, hauling the bearded man to his feet while yelling for him to hurry, only for the man to snap, "You're a lousy boy." Noyash convinced himself he'd been leaning on that man the whole time he was in the self-defense force, but the truth hit hard. It was never like that. Watching their old men go to war lit a spark in him, because deep down he'd always wanted to be the one who saves him. The man swallowed his words and took the help in total silence, while Douglas kept dodging the dragon in midair. Then he yelled at his uncle to go all in, and Robbie backed him up. He told everyone to step back and trust him, then vowed he'd wipe out the flames with wind magic, by mixing hell ice with his flight magic all at once. When the blow finally landed, it smashed the dragon down, and when it was over, they all rushed back together and demanded forgiveness. The bearded man swore he never meant to risk them and that he was truly sorry, and the magician waved it off, saying everything was fine. Now he just needed to lift his head. The rest backed their leader and nobody got hurt, so lift your head, especially since he's injured. Douglas dropped to a crouch, urging him to show his leg and calling on his own skills to help. The others yelled at the leaders to get up fast. He had to show his leg to the doctor, and he couldn't waste a second. Then he called out to Noyash and promised, "If I can't get up, I'll lean on you again, right on your shoulder." They hyped him up like, "Don't worry, we'll carry the loud stuff for you." But when the time came, those things were heavier than they'd ever admit, packed to the brim. They even handed him the leader's belongings, but these weren't just heavy, they were crushing. Once the job was done, he had to race back immediately, and then they still had to rush to the mayor's office to report the demonic black dragon. Sure, it made sense, but what were they really supposed to do with this dragon? They couldn't just abandon it here, and they definitely couldn't tear it apart with the puny gear they had. Right then, the mage hauled the dragon's corpse skyward with wind magic, because the belly holds its weight, and that's exactly what the wind can lift, as long as it doesn't twitch or move. Everyone lit up over the old man, and the leader demanded, "Who is he?" Noyce shot back, "I don't know, but he's one hell of a powerful adventurer, and he's got a kid with him." After he wiped out the demonic black dragon and marched back into the city, the crowd surged around the monster's corpse in the middle of town, and the man stepped forward to thank everyone for their hard work in bringing peace. Imagine a black demonic dragon showing up out of nowhere, and if the humans hadn't handled it, this city could have been erased from the map by now, so he stepped forward and begged for permission to thank the saviors for everyone. He ordered the reward to be handed straight to the commander of the self-defense forces, because there were plenty of them, and on top of the prize for taking down the red-eyed dragons, he also tacked on a reward for crushing the black demon dragon. He tried to sweeten the deal with an even bigger reward, but it all fell apart for some reason, and then the bearded man leaned in and told Douglas the gold was all his, because it was him who tore down the demonic black dragon. Everyone else nodded in full agreement, and they went along with it while he was still caught in that vision. He just waved his hand and said he couldn't take it, yet even after he calmed him down, things turned bad and he snapped into an attacker by pure chance. He only pulled it off because the others stepped up and played the tank role. He refused to be a tank, really, it wasn't that complicated since they were already getting jumped, but the moment he met the dragon, he wasn't about to face it solo. With those guys backing him up, he found a way to bring it down. He proposed splitting everything evenly since they'd clung to this win together. Then the bearded guy shrugged, swore he was being totally honest, and the others erupted in laughter. The moment he stepped into the room, his jaw dropped. He couldn't believe Douglas was this unpredictable, yet still soft-hearted, and that stunned man turned out to be the guildmaster of Addington. Right after that orphanage mess, he couldn't help but dig in. Then just as he was starting to wonder what rank he even belonged to, he got the shock of his life. His license had been revoked. Turns out it's real, but why would someone like him pull this off again? He never even tried to hide it and somehow made everything so obvious. So yeah, we've got to start with the real mystery. Why did the guildmaster suddenly care about all of this? The master warned, don't get me wrong, that cold way of talking is just his bad habit. And he didn't mock the magician, he was stuck on one thing: why revoke the license of a warrior who can actually bring down even a black dragon? So he went straight to the Balzac Guild to ask questions, but it was clear that the real problem wasn't his intent, it was his lack of strength, and that's when the truth clicked. The guild in Addington wants to hand him an application for a brand new license. He was stunned, so if he grants this license, will the adventurer inside him actually come back to life? They'd be giving it as a thank you for saving the village, the best he could possibly do as guild master, but would he say yes to the offer? Everyone's jaws dropped when the guildmaster personally sent an invitation, because none of them had ever seen anything like it before. Wait, had he really passed the entrance exam already? Still, he insisted he'd take it again, while others seethed, calling it cruel. Even though they've only just met him, everyone adores him, like crazy, and yeah, he's got real leadership energy, but with what's going on right now, he just can't wrap his head around the Balzac Guild's answer. If the magician wants, he can fire off a request to the investigative committee, but for now he's insisted. Hold up, give me 1 minute. Turns out the guild's call wasn't a mistake at all. Back then he was a total dead weight, useless for every job, even though he'd once been a top officer, and then everything spiraled fast downhill without mercy. Even if he can't make sense of it, it still isn't natural, injured or sick or not, because as long as recovery is possible, they just slap a temporary suspension on his license. Looks like he had no choice, he had to tell them the whole truth, he's cursed, and everyone instantly knew it must have been brutal for him. The master begged for forgiveness, swearing he'd stop sticking his nose into everyone else's business. But besides that, you've got nothing to worry about. He'll still team up with him to snag that new license, and they've got to move fast, like right now. Noish stood right beside him and said this was probably the sweetest relief imaginable, because sure, he'd suffered through everything, but now he could finally go right back to his old life, and the magician couldn't help but relive every harsh moment all over again. His old life felt like a dead-end nightmare, like he couldn't ever get his license back, so why wasn't he happier? But now his powers are back, and that means goodbye to the grind of day jobs for good. But honestly, the him wasn't feeling this at all. Douglas stared at Ravi beside him, while the master insisted they'd have to drop a document in his guild, and Douglas kept tightening his grip, saying he was still weighing whether to walk away from the whole thing. Everyone spun around, stunned. Why was he shutting them down? Sure, he knew the money would swing big once he got his license, but right now he didn't feel like ripping it back out or going back on it. He was grateful for their worry, and all he asked for was forgiveness. The master let out a heavy sigh and said he was truly sorry, but he couldn't just push him into it. Still, that idea is wild. The strongest traveler who's not in the guild, plus a guardian, that's gotta be amazing. The bearded guy burst into joyful shouting, yelling that since everything was settled, they had to grab drinks and celebrate right now, until the others shot him down because they were stuck in the mayor's office. For a split second, he wondered if he should quit the adventure life again, because he was stuck with Ravi, and Ravi had to come first if he was going to pay back the debt for helping him break free of that curse. That wasn't even the full story. Meeting strangers in a strange village and laughing with them felt unreal back then, and now he's honestly thrilled by the life he's living. 4 days later, the military police finally granted him permission to travel, and they warned him that Matlock and his men were about to be shipped to the prison in the royal capital. The demonic black dragon spoils got split up by the self-defense forces, and when it was his turn, he carved out just enough for travel to Balzac, then handed the rest straight over to the orphanage. Oh, and by the way, Matlock Orphanage got renamed Addington, and it looks like the whole town stepped in to run it now, so all we can do is pray the kids still there get a real shot at happiness. Ravi was draped in pricier, gorgeous clothes, and she looked downright charming. but he still couldn't help blurting an apology, then wondering, will this coat truly suit you? Before steering her towards something even better. Come on, look at the nicer options. But the girl wanted it the way her dad did, and they pushed deeper through the city, until all that remained were just a couple of stops. Then an old man named Theo called out to them, asking if they were already leaving. Right when he was mulling over his story, it hit him, his necklace. Should he sell it again? He still didn't get how that rare piece ever landed in his hands, because the only thing he could say was this. Once he broke the spell, it simply dropped beside him, and even he couldn't explain the rest. Theo heard the news and immediately erupted that it was a cursed dark item. He'd never touch it, so the stunned magician snapped back, saying he'd already broken the curse, meaning that accessory was safe now. He let out a shaky sigh because even if it was true, this whole mess still made his stomach drop. He was a good guy, but his zero tact was a problem, and he couldn't stop staring at how anyone could think that was okay. They barely know each other, but he's got a lead on a collector of cursed relics, Baron Morse, a wealthy man who lives it up in Milton, the Pleasure City. If you know him, he'll nod at any price and go see him, so he thanked the man, saying he owed the old man one. But really, that customer service is the merchant's job, because keeping buyers happy means they'll come back and spend again. He snapped his head toward the side and heard it, then stared at a massive crowd of residents packed in around him, like something was about to explode, and he couldn't figure out why. One person pushed through the group and said it was all rumors and adventure, and even a child was involved. He shot back, "So, are you talking about me?" Turns out he caught the director trading, then went and slew a giant dragon. Now the whole city is whispering his name like it's the truth, and they're praising him for cracking the case before he showed up, because without him, more people would have been slaughtered. They dubbed him Addington's hero. He just shook his head and said he only did what he could, and somehow that humility looked beautiful too. He pulled Robbie into his arms, shouting, "Hold on tight," because the crowd was already surging in around them. Out of the crowd, someone yelled at Douglas that he couldn't handle the crush, that he was getting praised while he struggled. Then these adventurers surrounded them, shoving the crowd back with brute force. He demanded to know why they were here, and sure enough, they'd come to see him off, ready to protect this hero, because they refused to let his last memories of this city get ruined. Douglas figured they'd dig a little deeper, promised to keep him strong, and begged him to come back and visit the city someday. Then the magician grinned, waved goodbye, and his daughter waved back too. For the first time he leaves like this, no clue if he'll ever meet them again, even so he'll never forget them. He's beyond grateful he got to meet them in this city, and as they walk away, he shouts that he owes them everything and that they should all stay healthy too. Douglas and Robbie lounged on a stone bank beside a small river, with a backpack sitting right next to them, and Douglas counted the days like a weight, 2 full days since they ditched Addington, and then the journey kept pushing them south. Douglas rubbed his chin, eyes locked on Robbie as he gulped from his flask, and the thought of their destination, Milton, the city of pleasures, hung heavy in his mind as he stared straight ahead. Douglas dropped to one knee and, without even looking up, asked Ravi if she liked fish. Ravi met his gaze and blurted out, "Yeah, I love fish." Right then, a tiny spotted fish splashed and swam in the river right in front of them. Douglas planted both feet on the ground and blurted, "That's perfect, let's catch and cook fish for dinner," while Ravi squatted there staring at him thinking, how is he even going to do that? Douglas rubbed his chin and said he'd use his skills, then told Ravi to jump in and help him today. Ravi locked eyes with Douglas and nodded she'd help. Right there on the ground lay cloth and rope, and Douglas insisted they had everything they needed: chocolate vine ivy, a jute bag, and the 3 branches Ravi had brought. Ravi stepped up beside him and gripped those branches in her hands. Douglas told everyone, first you link the branches, then you hook the jute bag on, and boom, there's your fishing net. Then Douglas lifted the net high, and Ravi shot her hands up in pure joy. Douglas and Ravi stepped into the water, only knee-deep for Ravi. Douglas told Ravi to drive the fish straight toward him, and Ravi just couldn't wrap her head around how she was supposed to do that. Douglas gripped the net in his hands and snapped his head to Ravi, telling her to figure it out on her own. Then he promised he'd dry her clothes later, and said she didn't have to hold back at all. Rocky stood right there, and Ravi bent down into the water. Ravi plunged her hands into the water, and the fish burst up right in front of her. Her eyes went wide, and her mouth fell open in pure shock. Douglas kept the net clutched in his hands and barked at Robbie to switch it up. While they stood a few steps apart in the river, Robbie splashed away, and Douglas stared, shocked at what he was seeing. Douglas waded in the water, net ready, when a fish shot out of the sea and landed right on top of his net. Ravi erupts in a scream of pure joy and throws his hands up to the sky. 2 fish sat skewered on shelves, roasting over a roaring open fire, and Rathi snatched one up, took a big first bite, grinned, and declared it was delicious. Douglas only stared, warning her to watch out for the bones. Douglas dives in too, staring at that sizzling fish like it's magic, and he swears he must have sprinkled the salt in just the right way. This season's silver cherry trout is so clean and soft, its flesh is fluffy, tender, and straight up melts in your mouth. Douglas and Ravi sat shoulder to shoulder by the fire, digging into dinner, and Douglas leaned over to ask if they'd really nailed it today. Ravi just nodded in full agreement as the flames danced and crackled beside them. Douglas stared ahead, mind racing, while Ravi slid into her jacket and said she had a gut feeling it was gonna rain today. Douglas and Ravi stood boxed in by sweeping fields and towering mountains, while clouds drifted overhead like they were watching them too. Douglas blurted, "What spell did you use to figure this out?" Ravi just smiled and said, "I can read the weather." And the second those words hit, Douglas's surprise exploded. Douglas yanked Robbie closer, stabbed a finger at the sky, and Robbie dropped into a crouch to stare. Right as Douglas explained, those drifting monsters overhead were cumulonimbus clouds that would dump rain for a short burst. Ravi shot his gaze up, stunned, and then a single drop splattered on his head. Douglas muttered that the stream had been running fuller than usual, though it was probably too soon for a weather shift. Next thing they knew, a brutal downpour erupted, soaking Ravi and Douglas where they sat on the ground, and both of them froze in pure shock. Douglas and Ravi huddle in raincoats as torrents of rain lash the road, fields, and jagged mountains stretching out around them. Douglas lifts Ravi in his arms and mutters that the irony is killing him, then tells Ravi to hang on a little longer, because he's honestly relieved he grabbed that coat for him. The nearest town is still at least half a day's walk away. Douglas urges them to grab a place to rest. Right ahead of them sits a tiny horse-drawn cart. Rain hammered down as a cart crammed with stuff sat stuck. One man planted in it while another dug in and shoved, trying to get it moving again. Douglas stares into the rain and realizes the cart is probably jammed, trapping the strangers inside, while Robbie is still cradled in his arms, so Douglas strides up to the cart, hands full, and offers the strangers his help. The stranger yanks his arrows free, and at the exact same second, Douglas snaps into a defensive stance. Bow in hand, he stands by a cart behind him, with Douglas squared up in front, ready to fight. The stranger even mutters an apology, but then flat out refuses help, tells Douglas and Ravi to bolt right now, and warns them they'd better leave fast. In the cart sat a cloaked child who blurted the word people, and Douglas snapped his head around in shock, realizing the strangers in front of him were an elf father and his child. Douglas still remembers that thick forest and swears he heard of elves who never leave the woods they were born in. Outside it, you can barely find them, because they're a different kind of people, all cautious and sharp, acting way too proud around humans. Douglas quickly shoved Robbie behind his back, and the elf raised his bow in front of him. Douglas burst through the silence and apologized for startling the strangers. He'd just been passing by, and then he offered his help again. The elf, bow in hand, stayed tight-lipped. Douglas pulled off his hood and admitted he did the same whenever fear caught him, especially now, since he had a child and a stranger could always count on him. Robbie stood there in silence as the elf and his child kept staring at Douglas and him with tense eyes. Then the elf finally gave in, dropped his bow, and thanked Douglas for saving him. Douglas strode up to the cart, dropped his backpack to the ground, and yanked off his cloak, and when the elf warned that the cart's load was too heavy for both of them, Douglas snapped, "Everyone back up a little." The elf child blurted that Douglas couldn't be trusted, but the elf snapped him to quit, be polite. Douglas grabbed the cart with both hands as someone shouted a spell and lit the engine at full power, and the elves went wide-eyed in shock. Right then, Douglas's muscles swelled, his teeth snapped tight, and steam blasted from his mouth. Then he yanked the cart forward, and everything started slipping out as Ravi and the two elves stood right behind him. Ravi shot her hands up in disbelief, while two elves stared in awe. A few meters later, Douglas slammed the cart to a stop, turning even the horses' heads in surprise, and the elf's child leaned forward, amazed, asking how it all happened. The elf snatched Douglas's things, thanked him with trembling gratitude, and called him their savior, so Douglas spun around and told them, "Don't worry, I'm just glad I could help." An elf shoved Douglas's things back into his hands, then bowed and mumbled that Louis was sorry for the rude way he'd acted. Louis's son, Nicky, stood right behind him, staring at Douglas with pure, starstruck admiration. Nicky scrambled into the cart, Ravi lunged for Douglas, and Louis stood there clutching his stuff. Then he announced, "Since gratitude deserves a gift, you get a few things," and Douglas shot back, thanking him, begging him to wait out the rain with them. Louis shot Douglas a look and said Douglas and Robbie could stay with them. Sure, the elves were extra careful, but that didn't mean they weren't grateful. Douglas tugged at Robbie's hood, and without hesitation, he accepted Louis' suggestion. Nicky burst out of the car, snatched Ravi's sleeve, and said, almost in a panic, that the kids were in the back, so Ravi had to come with him. Ravi and Douglas froze at the sudden, unexpected sight of Nicky. Ravi yanks his sleeve right out of Nicky's grip, and both Nicky and Douglas stare at her like she just stole something unbelievable. Ravi's eyes lock on Nicky, and Nikki immediately flushes red and blurts that she was only thinking about offering him her hand. Lewis hauls the stuff to the cart and blurts that Douglas has a cute daughter, and Douglas snaps his head in surprise as he lifts Ravi, then nods, agreeing with Lewis just as the cart finally starts rolling. Nikki perched on the wooden boxes in the wagon and gushed that Ravi's father was incredible, then wondered how Douglas managed to move the thing at all. While Louis and Douglas rode up front, Ravi kept nodding along in pure confusion, and Douglas just watched her with a deep, thoughtful focus. Douglas sat beside Louis and a smile cracked across his face. He couldn't shake the feeling that talking to Ravi just wasn't his strong suit because the girl was alone in the shelter, and he figured she was still embarrassed around kids her age. The horses kept rolling forward and Douglas stared ahead like, yeah, I'm terrible at social stuff, so he finally got why she struggled too. Her personality made it even harder, and the whole situation felt brutal. Douglas stroked his chin and thought, wouldn't it be great if Ravi found some friends? Then Louis grinned because they'd finally arrived. Ravi and Douglas snapped their heads up, stunned. Right in front of them, tiny buildings clung to the tree trunks. We're in the elven village, Floria, Douglas breathed. The boys yanked the cart to a stop and marched straight for one of the tree houses. Ravi was towel drying her hair while Douglas sat beside her, folding everything, when a woman with a face full of art showed up. She'd heard from her husband about them, and she thanked them like crazy for helping her through the rain. The woman grabbed Douglas's stuff, ordered Ravi to stick with them through the night so they could ride out the rain, and Douglas shot back a furious no. Then, right then and there, someone burst into the room and started casting a spell. A blazing flash lit up Douglas and Ravi, and both of them snapped their heads toward the glow in shock. Douglas even guessed it was wind magic, the kind that dries your clothes fast. Lewis pulled his wife into a tight hug while Nikki stood beside them, grinning like she had secrets. Then Lewis snapped his fingers, cast a spell, and told Douglas he'd better stop acting so modest. Douglas and Ravi just stared, eyes glued, totally captivated. Douglas sprang up off the floor and told Lewis they were ready to stay the night. Whatever he needed, he'd help. Ravi slid in beside him and stared at Douglas. Food piled up on the table as everyone gathered, and Louis warned them they barely ever left the village. Only shopping could tempt them, because monsters and dangers lurked everywhere. So Nikki hauled out a book and asked Douglas if he'd ever seen mermaids. Douglas remembered mermaids because in the southern seas there's a pirate crew run by them, and yeah, he's fought them before. Even as enemies, their singing was downright spellbinding. Nikki practically bounced as she asked Douglas if he'd ever seen a dragon. Douglas glanced at her and admitted he'd only just recently run into them. Then Nikki turned to Ravi and asked the same question, standing frozen in place while still clutching the book. Rain hammered the roof and Nick's excited shouts kept ringing out from the treehouse, until a relative snapped at him that if he wanted to talk, he'd better sit down and start from the beginning, asking about everything. Louis's wife scrubbed dishes in a basin with magic swirling around her, while Douglas lounged there and dug through stuff like he owned the place. Big bases piled right beside him, and an elderly elf sat nearby, rocking thick, long brows and a beard that looked like it had stories to tell. Douglas snapped his head around the moment Louis started talking, saying that because of him, he'd picked up real, valuable experience today. Louis slid into the seat beside Douglas, clutching 2 cups and a jug, and blurted that this was his first real chat with someone from another race, maybe elves, someone who understood more than his tiny, lonely little life, and Douglas reached out to grab the cup. Louis slides Douglas a cup and teases that Douglas probably thinks elves don't open their hearts to other races. Then Douglas freezes, shoulders sinking, convinced he's messed up and totally out of his depth. Across from them, Nikki and Ravi sit watching the kids, and boom, one of them casts a spell. Nikki flashed a grin and said the magic of light is pure radiance. Then she shot her finger up and a glowing ball of light burst into the air above them. Ravi stared in shock, unable to look away. The ball plopped down right in front of Douglas and Louis, and Douglas's jaw dropped like he'd just seen the impossible. Sure, he thought elves were good at magic for everyday chores, but watching one pull it off at that age blew his mind. Ravi whipped around to Douglas and blurted, "Dad, if she practices magic, could she pull off the same thing?" Douglas froze in shock that Ravi wanted to learn tricks too, but Ravi just grinned and nodded, agreeing with him. Nikki burst into laughter and promised, "I'll personally teach you, Ravi," then thrust his hands out and a beam of light flared between his palms. "Now remember the spell I just said, focus every ounce of that power right here in your hands." What? Douglas and Leo grinned while they listened to the kids talk. Nikki whispered, "Squeeze hard," and told Ravi, "Try chanting once with me." Then Nikki and Ravi knelt side by side and chanted the spell together, and when Ravi pressed her hands forward, the words tore the air, and a bright light flared between her palms. Then the world went pitch black. Ravi was on her knees, Nikki knelt right in front of her, and the adults just sat there watching as Ravi choked out, broken, that she couldn't. Douglas shot up to address Robbie, but Louis yanked him back with one hand, then pressed his other hand to his face and snapped out a clear SHH. Douglas stared at Louis, nerves clawing at him, and Nikki reassured Robbie, saying it wouldn't work, not right away. Nikki's smile spread like wildfire as she said, even he needed a whole month to pull it off, but if Robbie really wants to learn, he'll handle it while I'm here. Robbie stared at Nikki, stunned. Louis lifted his cup to his lips. Doug looked away with jittery nerves, then he grinned and scratched his head, because even he knew learning your first skill wasn't exactly easy when you didn't have a clue where to start. Douglas couldn't shake the question, why did Robbie suddenly want to learn those skills? Robbie dropped to her knees, staring up at Douglas, while Nikki stood right beside her. Nikki stared at Ravi and blurted, since I'm here, we've got to get Grandpa to test my skills. Ravi froze in embarrassment, and Louis and Douglas stared like they couldn't believe what they just heard. Nikki stood up and snapped, that power isn't something you grind your way into. It's built on the talent you're born with, and if you're not wired for it, no amount of practice will ever matter. Tears welled in Robbie's eyes while Douglas panicked, totally lost on what to do next. Then Louis praised Nikki, and Nikki gently took his grandfather's hand, telling him it's better to learn your predisposition now than to fall apart later. Robbie dropped to her knees and shook. Grandpa Nikki had no clue what they wanted from him, so Nikki snapped that he had to test Robbie's aptitude first, and then Grandpa Nikki shot his eyes wide open. Ravi and Douglas stared at the old man in pure horror as Grandfather slid into the seat across from Ravi, while the others hovered nearby, all eyes locked on. Douglas' nerves were shot. He even nodded along with Nikki's claim that a person's skills are locked in from birth and never shift, and then Grandfather stared hard at Ravi. The moment her eyes landed, fear hit her so fast that sweat beaded and poured down her face. Grandpa stayed planted across from Ravi and said there were certain abilities, while Nikki stood right beside him. Grandma marched in clutching a blanket, and Douglas and Louis couldn't stop shaking with nervousness. Robbie shot her hands up and called Douglas, and he watched the chaos unfold, clearly on edge. Tears spilled as she begged to learn the skills, and Douglas stammered nervously back that he knew. Nikki offered to show Ravi a few tricks as a demo, and Louis cut in, skills stick when you watch and feel it happen. Douglas nodded hard, firing back, Louis is 100% right. Douglas sprinted his hands forward and snapped that Robbie needed to watch close. Then he hurled a spell, and a bright cloud of light burst in his palms. Panic hit Douglas hard as he realized he might have misjudged the energy. Douglas dropped to his knees beside Ravi and the others, and a brutal flash of light lit up the whole room. Then everything went black. Ravi knelt, dazed and blinded, and Douglas, voice shaking, nervously begged her for forgiveness. Grandpa burst awake and roared that morning had arrived, and Douglas nervously blurted out an apology for what he'd done, because the others were still blinded too. Louis wiped his eyes, shocked, and gasped that the light was downright heavenly. Ravi stood beside Douglas, and when Louis joked, that's just a light skill, so who's Douglas? Nikki shot back, he's super cool. A sudden flash burst behind Douglas and Robbie, and a blinding light flooded the whole area. Everyone froze in confusion and fear until a brutal, loud noise slammed into the air. Douglas threw his arms around Ravi and yelled that it was lightning, like the sky had just snapped and trees had come crashing down. Hey, are you guys okay? He demanded. Louis nodded along and swore he was praying they hadn't landed on someone's house. Douglas jumped with nerves and asked, so there's no lightning rod in this village? Louis snapped back, no, we don't use stuff made by other races. Then Louis said the elves throw loud festivals just to keep lightning away. Douglas guessed this was one of those elven customs, and since he was the outsider, he swallowed his urge to interfere as everyone poured into the center of the house. Another elf barges into Louis's house, screams that disaster just struck. Lightning hit Muro's place, a fire erupted, and every attempt to douse it failed. It's spreading like wildfire, and the whole house could go up in flames. Louis, Douglas, and Ravi are all listening in pure horror. Douglas and Ravi freeze in shock, staring at that massive fire, terrified that if it keeps raging like this, the entire forest is about to go up in flames. Douglas storms up to the front door where Louis is waiting, tells him he'll go check on things, then whips over to Ravi and calls her over. Meanwhile, Louis swings the door open and there stands the elf. Douglas snaps his eyes to the doorway. The elf braved the pouring rain and started pointing, demanding why a man was there. Douglas snapped his eyes away, said nothing, grabbed Ravi and launched himself out the window, then told Louis he was sorry, but he'd go first. Louis' stomach dropped at Douglas's reckless move. Then Douglas leapt onto the window with Ravi cradled in his arms, flashed a everything's fine smile, and hurled a spell. Douglas snapped another spell, and him and Ravi launched into the air, streaking the other way from Louis' house, while Louis popped up and stared out the open window, totally stunned by what Douglas could do. The night swallowed everything in darkness while rain hammered the streets, and one of the elven villagers dropped to his knees, begging, screaming for help. The man shrieked that his wife and child were trapped under shattered wreckage, and the woman and the child were pinned beneath burning chunks of trees that were roaring in flames. A woman clung to her child even as rubble pinned them down, and around her the villagers thrust their hands up and blasted magic at the flames. But the fire didn't back off, it surged harder and roared brighter. An old villager warned that the forest would soon be nothing but ashes, and the only way out was to chop every last tree down. Douglas snapped, "Get back, all of you now," while he barreled forward, determined to stamp out the fire himself. The villagers went wide-eyed at what they heard, then Douglas slammed down beside them, clutching Ravi in his arms, still gripping her cloak tight. The whole town froze in shock, buzzing about one terrifying question. Why was a man lurking in their forest? Douglas snapped into action and started casting, then a massive chunk of water ripped out of the air. Douglas kept chanting, and that clump of water swelled bigger and bigger, until a gigantic water ball erupted above Douglas and the villagers, leaving everyone there stunned and completely lost. Douglas gripped Ravi with one hand, then thrust his other hand toward the open flames. Water thundered down and smothered the fire. Rain kept hammering down when one villager shouted that the flames were still roaring. Douglas stormed over, told him he understood elves were cautious, and if they didn't want them in the forest, they could leave right now. Douglas cradled Robbie in his arms and snapped that stopping the flames had to come first. He wasn't backing down, not when people were trapped and suffering. The whole village, young and old, stared at Douglas and Robbie with sharp, wary eyes. An old villager shot his hand up and promised he understood everyone's worries, then said it was time to unite with the man. Douglas just smirked in silence as Louis and his wife closed in from behind. Louis and his wife couldn't stop worrying about Ravi. Then Douglas finally let her down, but she wouldn't let go of his pant leg for a second. Douglas locked eyes with Ravi, and Ravi warned him to be careful. Then Douglas grinned at her words, telling her, "You can count on me." Villagers hurled spells while others battled to keep the wounded alive in the flames. Douglas grabbed a broken chunk of wood and fought the trap loose to free them. Douglas gripped the stone in both hands, spun around the moment he heard a villager crying out for help. Douglas spotted a bunch of men straining under a colossal tree slab, and beneath the rubble, villagers were trapped and screaming for help. Douglas sprinted to the giant fallen tree, shouted for everyone to back up, and promised he'd handle it. Then one villager blinked and asked how he could possibly help, so Douglas hauled onto the tree with both hands. Douglas slammed a spell into the air and yanked a massive chunk of wood overhead, while every other villager froze in stunned silence, eyes glued to the moment. Douglas strained to hold the tree over his head, and when a villager spat that he was a monster, the rain kept hammering down, while Douglas and the rest of the villagers kept hacking through rubble. The woman and child were left perfectly still, while her husband knelt beside them in full panic. One of the elves screamed that the wounds were deadly and that they had to call a doctor, but Douglas stepped in and snapped that there was no need to. Douglas thrust his hand forward and started casting. Magic flared and a glowing dome slammed into place over the woman and the child, while the other elves stared, frozen in awe. The woman crushed her child to her chest, then snapped her eyes open, while Douglas kept chanting, telling the wound to heal right now. The elf man clutched his wife and child to his chest and broke down in bitter tears, while Douglas stood right beside him, staring at the family finally reunited. Douglas slipped aside just as the rain finally eased up, convinced the flames were finally dead, yet he and Ravi had still blown up the whole village because they weren't even meant to be there. Douglas trudged through the wreckage, forcing a grim smile as he realized he could only feel awful for Louis and everyone left behind, but him and Robbie still had to push on to another city, no matter what. Right then a voice shouted his name, and Douglas snapped around to face whoever was calling. Douglas spun around and the whole village was down on their knees, pouring out gratitude like they'd just witnessed a miracle. Robbie stood right there, clutching her wife Louis in her arms, and watched everything unfold. The next day rolled in and Douglas peered out the window. At least the sky finally cleared, but the damage from that awful night was still everywhere, while the villagers hauled through the wreckage of collapsed houses, stone by stone. Douglas spun to Louis and said, "If it doesn't bother anyone, we're in. Tell her we'll help move everything and we're ready to go." Louis grinned back, "We'll all be glad to help." Then Douglas leaned toward Ravi and demanded, "So what are you even doing here?" "What?" Robbie doesn't even get a second. Nikki's scream rips through the air and he snaps that if Robbie runs to help, he'll go with her. Louis just stands there and refuses, while Robbie freezes in silence, Nikki seething because Louis treats him like a kid, and Roddy tells Douglas she'll stay right there in the house with Nikki too. Douglas shot to his feet and declared the kids would be safer together than stuck with the adults. Then Douglas and Louis marched straight into the village. One of the residents stepped up, greeted them, and loudly praised Douglas as a strong man. Douglas froze in shock. Villagers closed in around him, flooding him with thanks and grabbing his hand to shake it, and when confusion hit hard, Douglas just muttered that he was happy to help. Douglas stood there completely baffled, and a young villager told him they had to prove their team spirit. Then the villagers grabbed a massive tree and started hauling it into motion, leaving Douglas stunned by the chaos. Douglas rubbed his chin like he was plotting something big, and Louis leaned in to say the residents had been showing surprising strength, because ever since Douglas backed them, they'd been cheering him on like a hero. Douglas stared at Louis, thrown off by what he just said. Louis insisted the elf race was still weak, so Douglas snapped his gaze to the tree, where the girls stood watching him like they already knew the outcome. Douglas stared at the girls and instantly turned red with pure, crushing embarrassment. The entire village snapped to attention when one resident screamed that harvest time was here. The night rolled in, and the bell rang. Douglas and Louis barged into Louis's house, and right away his wife was waiting for them. Douglas frowned, sure, the cleaning wasn't done yet, and in this forest there were no elves to magically hand out a muscle strength buff. He didn't just stand there, he immediately decided he'd help with that fallen big tree. Ravi sprinted up to Douglas, and her face lit up the second she saw he'd made it back. Louis' wife clutched a tray and said Ravi never quit practicing magic, while Nikki kept grinning like, yeah, he acts like a teacher, because he pushed Ravi into brutal, non-stop intensive training. Ravi grinned and insisted she still couldn't pull it off. Douglas kept staring at her, then he stepped closer and asked if she was okay, while Nikki stood right beside them. Douglas fidgeted with nerves, convinced Ravi's smile only showed up when she was pretending to be happy, like she was dragging it out of herself, so he cupped her face and told her he'd check her status right away. Douglas shoved his hand toward Ravi's face, and glowing magical symbols exploded into the air. Then Douglas muttered a spell under his breath, while Ravi's hair whipped wildly in every direction. Symbols flashed in front of Douglas as her status read, "Cold Ravi had a cold." Douglas grabbed Ravi by the shoulders and, with nerves cracking his voice, yelled that she was sick and exhausted. The elves pushed for a doctor, but Ravi just stood there in silence, and a faint blush crept across her face. Ravi sprawled under a blanket in bed, while Douglas sat right beside her, eyes locked on her like he wasn't ready to look away. He realized too late that something was wrong. His healing skill could only slam shut physical wounds, not cure diseases at all. Ravi sprawled on the pillow, her cheeks blazing red, and Douglas swore it was just overdoing magic during training that wiped her out. Yet Douglas couldn't figure out why Ravi kept pushing herself to practice again and again. Douglas perched on the tree branch that ran right through the house, and when Ravi told him she was begging for forgiveness because she kept stirring up trouble, Douglas nearly fell off with shock. Ravi snapped her eyes open and blurted that she wanted to be with Douglas, and though Dad dragged her wherever he went, Mr. Beard and everyone else's fury kept flashing back into Douglas's mind. The angry faces wouldn't leave him. Douglas stood up, and Ravi kept lashing out that she was nothing but a burden, useless, a problem waiting to happen, while begging that she wanted to learn magic so she wouldn't trouble Douglas anymore. Tears streamed as she pleaded for forgiveness, and when Douglas finally stared back at her, it hit him. This was why Ravi had been clawing to master those skills over and over. Douglas slid his hand onto Ravi's bed and told her, straight up, he'd never once seen her as a burden. Then his mind flashed back to her face, and he couldn't shake the truth that no matter what he said, she still wouldn't let herself forgive. Even that morning, she stayed home, not because of Nika, but because of the cruel words about how children can't really help the adults. Douglas replayed every trouble ahead on the road and realized hauling Ravi on that hike might have been a terrible call, because the mess they ended up in only made her worry harder. Douglas slid beside the bed, brushed the tears off Ravi's face, and promised, "When life throws us into a hard corner, I'll think for myself and act on it, but I won't take over the final call just like you." Douglas shot Ravi a look and told her they'd figure out the next move together, and Ravi grinned back. She agreed with him, but she promised she'd still try her hardest not to be a burden. Douglas crouched by the bed, swore she wasn't a burden, and told her he fully understood what she was going through. She just had to get a grip so he wouldn't keep worrying. Ravi flashed a smile and nodded along. Then Lewis strode in and said the doctor would be there any minute. Douglas thanked him, and when he turned back, he locked eyes with Ravi again. Douglas shot up and promised Ravi he'd cook her something if she wanted to eat. Then Ravi smirked and demanded the soup he made on their very first day together. Douglas shot back that he'd get it done immediately. Then he bolted out of the room and hit the stairs. Lewis' wife pressed a tray of food into Douglas' hands and told him, "Take this to Ravi." Douglas grinned at the absolute cuteness of it, tiny little portions shaped like baby rabbits. Douglas snatched the tray and grilled her about how she cut the food like a pro and begged to learn her secret. She burst out laughing and said Douglas was a great father, and those words hit him hard as he just stood there thinking. Louis' wife admitted she was shocked when Douglas instantly clocked the shift in Robbie's condition, because parenting hits you like a truck, and Douglas snapped back that he still wasn't handling it all that well. Robbie's soup was simmering in the pot while Louise's wife drilled Douglas on how to slice perfect rabbit shapes from fruit. Then Douglas nailed it and slid a whole tray full onto the rack. Robbie was munching sap when Douglas leaned in and asked if she wanted something else. Then he brought apples, and Louis's wife sliced them up for her. Robbie's jaw dropped, then he lit up with pure, unstoppable delight. Douglas thrust a tray of sliced fruit into her hands. Douglas clutched the tray and Robbie grinned, saying she loved the rabbits in the back. Then Douglas stammered, all nerves, that he definitely wasn't the one who chopped them up so messily. Robbie grinned, squeezing a slice of fruit in her hands, while a bowl of soup sat nearby. She told Douglas she liked this rabbit better, and instant tears of pure happiness flooded his eyes. Douglas and Ravi rode the wave of Louis's goodwill and the villagers' trust, staying put until Ravi finally bounced back, while Douglas pitched in nonstop, cleaning up and helping wherever he could. Just before they were about to leave the village, Nika's grandfather slid across from Ravi and made her prove herself one more time, while everyone else crowded close, holding their breath as he thrust his hand up in front of Ravi's face and said he could see something. Grandpa kept telling Ravi not to worry. He said she had a gift for learning any skill, and Ravi and Douglas lit up with pure joy as Grandpa pushed one last thing. She needed to grind hard to awaken that power. Ravi and Douglas sat face to face with their grandfather, hanging on every word as he revealed that Ravi's skill potential was 5120, leaving Douglas absolutely stunned and thrilled, while Ravi just stared, completely lost on what those numbers even meant. Douglas claimed a person's usable potential averages at 3. If it's 0, they have 0 predisposition for skills, and the higher that number climbs, the easier it becomes to master even the most complicated techniques. Robbie demanded to know Douglas's skill potential, and Douglas shot back, 900. Louis went pale at the number, convinced there was no way such a small stat could fuel spells that strong. Douglas nodded when his grandfather challenged him to a test of his potential. Grandpa grilled Douglas about his potential and declared, just like Douglas claimed, it was 900. Louis still refused to believe it, so Grandpa snapped back that Douglas had poured his heart into every spell. Douglas and Louis stared at Grandpa, frozen. Grandpa rubbed his hands together and told Douglas how much he admired the life he'd built so far. Then Douglas lit up with a smile and looked straight back at him. At a tiny fence, the villagers poured out their goodbyes to Douglas and Ravi, while Nicky stood there with his head bowed, asking if they truly meant to leave, only for Douglas and Ravi to thank everyone and walk off, never hearing him. Douglas and Ravi stared at Nicky, shocked as his voice exploded. He snapped that Ravi still hadn't picked up a single skill, warned she'd catch a cold again, and insisted they had to head straight for the village. Ravi looked at Nicky, stunned. Nicky's scream shot even higher. She blurted that she loved Ravi, that she wanted to stay with her forever, that she wanted Ravi as her bride, while Douglas froze, utterly stunned by what Nicky just said. The villagers started whispering to each other, and Douglas couldn't shake the feeling that he was the only one not picking up what was going on between Nicky and Ravi. Nicky started to say more, but Ravi cut in, gripping Douglas tight and blurting out that she likes Douglas. Nicky froze, stunned by what he'd just heard, while the women of the village stared at Douglas, too embarrassed to look away, yet clearly moved by everything unfolding. Douglas and Ravi stood there in silence too, until Louis snapped that this was not the moment to bring the subject up. Douglas scratched his ear, a little embarrassed, and blurted out that he might be Robbie's adoptive father, and honestly, that idea felt incredibly kind. In that moment, he wasn't pretending at all. Pure, sincere love for Robbie filled his whole heart. Ravi clung to Douglas, convinced that if she was truly his daughter, he'd be staring at her with way more sincere awe, and both of them jumped when a sharp burst of laughter erupted. Louis brushed his rejected son's head, then stepped up to Douglas and snapped that he shouldn't listen to Nicky. People say boys grow up carrying broken hearts, and Douglas just stared at Louis in shock. Louis pressed everything the whole village had gathered into Douglas's hands, and Douglas shot Louis a heartfelt thank you. Then Douglas and Ravi waved goodbye to the entire village and took off. The villagers shot waves back at Douglas and Ravi, and Louis locked eyes on Ravi and Douglas, counting down 2. Every single person in the village screamed muscle power, and Douglas and Ravi watched the place rip apart and break away. Nicky sat right where he said goodbye to Ravi, and Louis stormed up asking how much longer he planned to stay there. Nicky just told his father that once he grew up, he'd leave the village. Nicky's mind flashed with mermaid visions, and Douglas leaned in and told him about treasures you can only find in books. Now he can't stop thinking about seeing it all with his own eyes, learning every skill he can, and blasting off on a journey. Nicky sobbed her heart out and pleaded for the chance to see Ravi again. Louis stared at his son, then gently brushed his head as he said he knew Nicky would make it. He was so proud. Louis dropped into a squat beside him, and together they stared off into the distance. Douglas and Ravi didn't slow down. They kept blazing forward on their journey. Douglas clutched everything the village had handed him and swore he'd never felt happier, because the Alvin village had accepted him, and this was the coziest place he'd ever known. Douglas yanked a letter from his bag and read it. Louis had sincerely thanked him for the help, and now he was seriously thinking about getting a lightning rod installed. Douglas's eyes went wide as he read those words. Douglas kept reading. This time it was blunt. The village lacked the tech they needed, so they'd have to reach out to others, even if he didn't expect to meet many good people like him, but he'd still find a way to compromise. Douglas cracked a smile and kept reading, because it was Douglas who had planted the idea of compromises in Louis's head, and Louis was honestly grateful. Raffi shouted at Douglas, and Douglas snapped his eyes up from his book. Up in the sky, a rabbit-shaped cloud drifted past, and Ravi was pointing at it like it was the best thing he'd ever seen. Douglas and Ravi stared up at the sky in awe and pushed on, apples from the elf village stuffed in their bag. A chariot strapped to 2 horses charges up a little hill, and behind it you can see a whole swarm of mills stretching out across the landscape. Douglas and Ravi rode in a chariot, rattling toward Milton to sell the necklace that's driving Ravi's curse, while Douglas smiled and Ravi stared out the window, thinking back on everything they'd been through. The wagon kept rolling farther from the mills, and Douglas couldn't shake the feeling that the trip to Milton would take days. Town stops first, then they'd ditch the wheels and walk the rest of the way to Balzac. Douglas stared at Ravi, who kept his eyes locked on the window as the windmill spun outside, and Douglas made up his mind. He was going to show Ravi just how beautiful the world could be. Douglas heard 2 passengers talking and spun around, because they were laying out the hero Alan's team in Balzac, recruiting fresh members, and when Douglas caught the name they said, fear hit him hard. Douglas couldn't forget the leader of the groups, Alan and his crew. He swore Alan had left Balzac a few months back, yet the group is still there. And Douglas wouldn't buy the idea of recruiting new faces because that team always ran at a fixed minimum size. Douglas spun toward the passengers and demanded to hear everything they knew about Alan's group, but they just shrugged and said, "We already told you everything," then flat out admitted they had no other leads, so Douglas gave a sheepish smile and apologized for bothering them. Then the girl in the black cloak leaned in and demanded how much Douglas would pay just to get the answers, and Douglas ordered her to say it again. She yanked off her hood, dragged her fingers over the fabric, and told Douglas she was a seamstress from Balzac, full of juicy info he'd love to hear, but her answers didn't come free, and since he didn't exactly scream rich, she offered him a killer discount. Douglas froze in the corridor and stared at the girl, already itching to dig up anything he could about his old comrades. One of the passengers leaned in and told the girl she was a magician from Milton, right to her face, while the girl bristled at every word, and Douglas just stood there with his mouth hanging open, staring at the whole scene. The passengers started roaring threats at the girl, telling her that if she kept causing trouble, they'd hand her straight to the military police, but she just glared at them with furious intensity and said nothing. Ravi stared at Douglas's back, then Douglas whipped around and ruffled Ravi's head and kept staring ahead. He even apologized to the passengers nearby for bothering them, while the girl propped her chin on her hand and said Douglas was trying hard to play the good guy. Douglas thrust out his hand and told her she could be either a seamstress from Balzac or a magician from Milton. There was nothing wrong with it at all, so the girl frowned, then snapped her gaze away. The girl crossed her arms tight to her chest and erupted that she wouldn't keep talking to Douglas now that her secret was out, while Douglas glanced aside and flashed a smile. Then the carriage rolled on and she went silent. 5 long days dragged by, then Douglas and Robbie finally rolled into Milton, scouted house after house right in the heart of town, and there it was, a river cutting through everything. Douglas slapped a map on the table, showing a river that split the whole city into 3 massive parts. The Old City, the rich 16th District on the left bank of the Lura River, and the third stretch, Bacchus Alley. With those gorgeous rooftops straight ahead, Douglas and Ravi sprinted toward Area 16 to find Morse. He was meant to buy the necklace, but when they arrived, he was nowhere to be seen. Douglas and Ravi were told Morse would return in 5 days, so they tore off toward Bacchus Alley. Douglas strolled beside Ravi and said he didn't care about waiting 5 whole days for Baron Morse, and Ravi nodded right along, backing him to the end. Douglas and Ravi strode down the street while locals clinked drinks nearby, and Ravi said she could wait, because she had no idea who might even buy that dark necklace, so Douglas shot her a look and turned toward her. Ravi grinned and clutched her bag like it was a lifeline, then told Douglas she loved traveling with him, and she was totally fine keeping the journey going. Douglas figured that the longer the journey dragged on, the bigger the bill would get too, and sure, coming back to the city fast would let Robbie finally settle for good, but what if he was just daydreaming? Douglas caught her meaning and broke into a smile. Then Douglas scooped up Ravi by the arms and snapped that they'd rest a bit. Milton was a big city, so they could chase all kinds of sweets, while he clung to Ravi, and the whole crowd, including the residents, got pulled in by a sudden scream. Douglas lowered Ravi to the ground, then snapped that he'd scout what happened and find a hiding spot close by, because right now, a bunch of people were packed into that tight alley. The dude in the long hair and button-up shirt just stood there with his hands in his pockets, rings flashing on every finger. 3 men hovered over Ted, who knelt there as the shirted guy snapped that Ted had to go get the girl. Ted crumpled to the ground, trembling with terror, begging that he couldn't bring the girl. His mission was to protect Princess Rose, and the shirted man snapped, furious, ordering his escorts to beat him. They yanked out sticks and started swinging at Ted. Douglas's furious shout cut through the chaos. "Stop, Teddy's already wounded," and he slammed himself between the bandits and Teddy. With a straight face, Douglas swore he had no clue what happened, then shot back that jumping in and attacking one guy was too far. But the swordsman yanked him by the jacket and screamed that Douglas better stay out of it, because if he kept meddling, he'd get hurt too. Douglas snatches the man's hand by the shirt, then hands Gil his clothes, yet the moment it all clicks, shock hits him hard, and his hand starts to tremble uncontrollably. Carlos bites down hard, baffled by where Douglas, still gripping his hand, pulls that insane strength from. His assistants shout for him, but Carlos snaps at them to shut up. Then Douglas calls Carlos's name and panic hits him like a punch. Douglas stared at Carlos and demanded, "Let me go right now." Carlos grit his teeth and stayed silent while his hand kept trembling like crazy. Douglas and Carlos get ripped apart as their hands separate. Carlos clamps onto his own hand, spins away from Douglas, and snaps at the deputies that they need to get out now. The deputies freeze in shock, then scramble off, while Douglas stands there watching them vanish. Carlos snaps his fingers at Douglas, signaling, "I got eyes on you." The bandits back off Douglas and Teddy, and Douglas rubs the back of his head like the tension just vanished. "Robbie, come out, you're safe now." Robbie peeks around the corner and Teddy, still on his knees, whips his gaze toward where Robbie is. Teddy tried to push himself up, but pain doubled him over instantly. Douglas stared at him and snapped, "You okay?" and knew right then Teddy's leg looked broken. Douglas dropped to one knee, thrust his hand toward Teddy, and unleashed a healing spell. Then Teddy stared at his leg, shocked that the pain was gone. Douglas stared at Teddy and boomed that he'd sealed his hurt leg with magic, but even with the body fixed, his mind hadn't caught up yet, so walking was still going to be rough for a while. Teddy stared at Douglas, clawed at the air to stand, but his legs buckled and he crashed down, and Douglas and Ravi panicked, terrified for him. Douglas shot his hand out toward Teddy and told him to hand over a cane, saying he planned to escort Teddy home. Teddy just grinned and thanked him. Douglas clutched Teddy in his arms as they tore through the city streets, until they finally hit the red light district of Macy at the red light. They stood before this massive gate while people streamed in and out nonstop. Douglas couldn't believe what he was seeing in the red light district. Teddy hooked one hand on his shoulder and told him the place he works is right behind the gate. Douglas snapped his head toward Teddy and demanded again where he worked. Teddy just smirked and said he worked at an entertainment venue. Teddy stared at Douglas, completely lost, and Douglas shut his eyes and figured the place had to be closed. After all, it was only noon. Then he nodded and agreed to go to work for Teddy. A long house sat on the street with a bunch of outbuildings nearby. Trees crowded the yard, and laundry snapped and fluttered in the wind. Then Douglas and Teddy slipped into a room with a table and chairs. Douglas glanced around and muttered that it was way quieter than he'd ever imagined. Then Teddy leaned on his shoulder and said, "It's just an outbuilding behind the main place, and everyone's still out cold." Douglas helped Teddy sink into the chair, but he couldn't shake the feeling he was being way too cautious. Because if a fight broke out here, it could seriously mess with Ravi, so they had to get out of this place fast. A woman draped in dark clothes stormed into the room and demanded why Teddy looked like he'd been through hell. What happened? Teddy snapped his gaze to her and said Douglas had shielded him from Carlos, and the woman immediately thanked Douglas. Douglas flicked his hand like it was nothing, telling them not to worry, and the woman brightened up at once. She wouldn't let Douglas walk away. They had to sit down, and she'd treat them to cake. The second Ravi heard cake, he bolted straight for the table. On the table sat a fancy tea set, sharp cutlery, and a towering cake, while Ravi dug in with a fork, cheeks lit up, soaking up compliments about her looks. Behind Ravi and Douglas, still sipping tea and crunching cake, stood the girls from the place, whispering about how Douglas had saved Teddy. Douglas fidgeted with his cup, sipping like he couldn't quite believe it, while he kept thinking those girls' outfits were way too revealing. Dressed in black, she snapped that Douglas had just pulled them out of Carlos and his henchmen, because lately they'd been wrecking their lives, while Douglas kept right on sipping his tea. The woman slammed her hands on the table and told Douglas he could stay and start working as their bodyguard, leaving Douglas absolutely stunned. She kept insisting he had to stay on guard for 5 days, that the pay would be great, and that once a few things got sorted, those troublemakers wouldn't be able to mess with them anymore. Douglas started counting down the plan, exactly 5 days in this city, then snapped that he wouldn't stay, claiming he was on the move and not with a child in tow. Right after that, the women jumped in, pushing hard for Douglas and Ravi to linger a while. Douglas stared at the women, completely thrown off, then they closed in around him. In his head, he figured if he stayed by himself, he could help them. But in just these few days they'd be stuck here, Ravi might end up seeing things she absolutely shouldn't. Douglas sat in his chair and flatly refused their offer, and the woman in black swallowed hard as she pleaded for forgiveness, claiming what she was asking for was just too much. Ravi stared at Douglas, and behind her the women murmured that they'd somehow made it this far, and this time they'd crack it for real. But Ravi's spirits sank, and on the table sat a plate with half-eaten cake. Night dropped like a curtain, and the house windows flickered to life. Ravi sat on the bed, watching Douglas wipe things down, and asked, "Aren't you going to help those people we met today?" Douglas froze in silence, and right at that moment Ravi's eyes spilled over. Tears started pouring down his face, and Douglas went cold with fear at what he was seeing. Douglas jerked up from his chair, panic exploding in his chest. He had no clue why Ravi was crying her heart out, tears pouring harder and harder. Horror twisted his face, and then he rushed in, trying to calm her down. Ravi and Douglas sat side by side on the bed, while a table, a chair, and a backpack crowded the small space nearby, and Ravi pressed a towel to her face as Douglas stared at her, convinced she was furious with him. Ravi set the towel on her feet, and Douglas just kept staring, brooding that since he never helps anyone, it left him feeling crushed. Douglas pictured a guy and a girl wrapped in a hug in front of those houses, thinking he could finally explain to Ravi why he did it. But when it came to letting her anywhere near an adult place that could twist her ideas, he knew she'd never get it. Douglas stared at Ravi's tear-streaked face and thought, if I tell her how the adult world really works, it'll wreck her asterisk, so he pushed that aside. He only wanted to show her beautiful things. Ravi shattered the silence and asked if he could finally explain why he refused to help those people, then stared at him like a spotlight, waiting for Douglas to talk. Douglas met Ravi's eyes and said nothing. Douglas dropped his head, sure he couldn't twist the truth to fit the moment, just another grim lesson about adults. He hesitated to tell Ravi the real reason he was refusing. Ravi stared at him, called out, and Douglas snapped to attention. Ravi demanded to know who Douglas wouldn't help, and Douglas stared her down and snapped, "That's not it." Then Ravi pressed, "So why won't you help them?" Douglas shut his eyes tight. Douglas's feet were planted on the floor, while Ravi's feet hovered like he didn't dare touch it. Douglas warned him they'd been headed to an adult establishment. Ravi had no clue what that meant, so Douglas snapped his arms shut and declared it was a bad place, and Ravi leaned in, hanging on every word. Douglas stared at Ravi and said, "Picture this, someone you love pulls you into a hug and your heart lights up." Ravi grinned and shot back, "That's me. I'm happy the second you hug me." Douglas hesitated. Douglas shuffled the neatly dressed people around and said, "Yeah, spotting someone like that is rare, but not everyone gets that luck." Then he leaned in and explained how some men drown their loneliness by paying women to act affectionate with them in an adult place that wasn't for the faint of heart. Ravi stared at Douglas and blurted out, "So paying money just to get attention, does that make you bad?" Douglas pressed a hand to his chest and said, "Nah, people are just trying to drown their loneliness that way, and that doesn't make them wrong." What? Douglas swung toward Ravi and said paying for love is just heartbreaking, so he wouldn't let Ravi anywhere near that place. Ravi stared back and demanded why Douglas was blocking them, and Douglas nodded, while Davy's eyes dropped to the floor. Douglas stared at Ravi and told him, "Your intentions might be good, but that still isn't a reason to turn your back on helping people." Ravi braced her hands on her knees and admitted that when she was alone at first, sadness hit her hard too, until she met Douglas. Ravi spun around and met Douglas's eyes, saying she liked him more because he actually helps people, so she was going to push for him to help them, no matter what. Douglas stared at Ravi and decided that adults must lead children, then remembered how, earlier, they'd both agreed to talk through every decision and piece of advice with Ravi. Douglas shot his gaze away and flashed a grin, then hurried to apologize to Ravi for how he'd acted. The very next day, Ravi and Douglas marched up to an entertainment place, and right outside, drunks and homeless folks sprawled on the street, staring at them. Douglas couldn't stop wondering what Ravi would think. Ravi just looked around, took it in, and even seemed to enjoy the sunshine. Douglas leaned in and gently stroked her head, and when he looked up, he realized he'd been worrying too hard. Ravi watched her see the beauty in life for herself, and he knew he had to open his eyes and view the whole world more broadly. Douglas slammed his hand on Ravi's shoulder, and there they were, trapped by towering buildings along the street, while Douglas realized he needed a lot more patience to protect the people he loved without crushing them, and then Ravi and Douglas both jolted at the screams tearing through the middle of the road. A pack of armed men lined the street, guns ready to blaze. Carlos and his crew had the whole area locked down. They cornered Teddy as he lay on the ground, while the owner of the entertainment place watched in fear, and Carlos barked for Princess Rose to be dragged to him. The place's owner was in full panic mode, other girls huddled behind her, and Carlos kept firing off threats. Then a long-haired girl stormed out of the building, glaring at the racket like it personally offended her. Rose appeared in a see-through dress in the doorway, and she snapped, telling them they were making way too much noise, leaving everyone in the place staring in stunned disbelief. Carlos strode up to Rose and declared, "Today you're mine, no question." Rose didn't blink. She demanded, "If you wanted me this bad, then go on, leave this place." And Carlos, he was completely shattered by how fast that turned. Rose closed in and with a sweet smile told him she had zero time for him and his crew. Then Carlos's eyes flared with rage as he grabbed Rose by her clothes, swung her around and started tearing into her, but Rose didn't blink for a single second. Douglas suddenly pops up beside Carlos and Rose and snaps at Carlos to stop, leaving everyone stunned, while Carlos, hands still raised, whips his gaze toward Douglas. A dark aura clung to Douglas, and rage burned in his eyes. Carlos and his henchmen couldn't help but panic in fear. Fear hit the bandits hard. Douglas was still fresh in their minds, so they huddled and whispered to each other until Carlos barked, "Shut up." Douglas's eyes flared with fury, Carlos crumpled into pure terror, and he and his henchmen bolted for the hills, while Douglas and Robbie stood there, watching the bandits scatter. Douglas leaned toward Ravi, scooped her into his arms, and blurted, "I'm sorry I'm this late." Then he straightened up and said he wanted to take the offer, become the entertainment establishment's bodyguard. The woman in black and the staff stared at Douglas in awe. Rose strode up beside Douglas and Ravi, leaned in, and blurted out how thankful she was to Douglas. Rose strode up to Douglas's clothes, offered her help with a grateful gesture, and just like that, Douglas went rigid with shock, then flat out refused. Then bam, a girl in a short dress bursts in with a shovel, sprinting and shrieking that she'll save Princess Rose, drives the crowd back, and ends up right behind her. The girl spun in panic, staring at the chaos, still clueless about where the bandits vanished to, while Douglas and Rose froze at the sudden arrival of a stranger. Their eyes snapped to the dark-haired girl on the ground, who just sat there, watching them. A dark-haired girl in a dress and shoes crouched low, squinting, while Douglas stood over her, one hand gripping Ravi in his arms. She suddenly jabbed a finger at him, and in that instant both of them snapped back to the memory of when they first met in the stagecoach on the way to the city. The woman in black blinked in shock when Veronica, the dark-haired girl, said she knew Douglas, and with a dramatic sweep of her arms, Veronica insisted they were only just getting acquainted while Rose stood right there, watching it all unfold. Veronica snapped her head around, knotted her brow, grabbed Douglas by the sleeve, and demanded he move aside, while Roddy clung to Douglas's neck in panic, terrified by Veronica's sudden move. Veronica grabbed Douglas's hand and yanked him down the street, and the girls at the pleasure house stared in shock as Douglas, Ravi, and Veronica split up, Ravi landing beside Douglas while Veronica stood opposite them. Veronica folded her arms tight under her chest and warned that she'd never forgive Douglas or Ravi if they blabbed about what happened in the carriage. Douglas just stood there in silence, staring at her. Douglas demanded to know what Veronica was even talking about, and she snapped, thrashing her arms, stomping her heel, and roaring that she'd tried to fool Douglas and he had to keep it secret. Douglas shot his hand forward and told Veronica not to sweat. He wouldn't spill a single word about what happened because he was in this city for a different mission. Veronica demanded proof, and Douglas couldn't believe she'd say that. Veronica came charging at him and barked that Douglas had to swear he'd never spill a word about this, because in her eyes, there wasn't a single soul in the world she could trust. Douglas scratched his head, baffled out of his mind. Then Veronica grinned and said she was ready to pay him for keeping quiet, and Douglas froze, shocked by the words that just came out of her mouth. Veronica shoved Douglas into the wall, pressed her hand to his clothes, and told him she'd be waiting at her place tonight, then ordered him to leave Robbie with someone before he left. Ravi stood right there, cheeks blazing red, totally clueless about what was happening. Douglas shoved off the wall, slid toward Ravi, and pressed his hand over her as if to stop what was coming next. Then he snapped that he wasn't there to preach, even as he called Veronica's behavior totally inappropriate. Veronica braced herself with one hand against the wall and blurted out that meeting someone like him was her first time ever. Douglas gently shut Robbie's eyes, but as Veronica began pawing at her and shrieking, "I don't even know what part of her body I'm touching, she looks like a child," the whole scene turned terrifying. Douglas told her to calm down, and the women standing nearby erupted in laughter at the chaos unfolding in front of them. Douglas gripped Robbie's shoulder and swore he'd guard Veronica's secret, no payments, not a single coin, because he had to keep his word, and Veronica couldn't wrap her head around why he'd refused the money. Veronica gripped her bag tight, then snapped that Douglas was a hypocrite, acting like he was better than her. Douglas shot back that if Veronica coughed up hush money, it'd become a contract, not a real agreement, and without that payment he'd stick to his promise. Douglas froze in shock when Veronica exploded into screams, swearing she couldn't believe a word he said. If it took a contract, she'd bet her heart he'd never betray her. Then she hurled the money at him with pure rage. Douglas spun away and stared at the ground, convinced that a signed contract still wouldn't keep the silence locked tight. He couldn't figure out why Veronica refused to let go. Then she screamed and swung her arm, hurling the bag of money straight onto the ground. The woman in black shrieked with shaky nerves, and she couldn't wrap her head around why Veronica was acting like this. Veronica whipped around at the woman's scream, and Douglas stood beside her, totally baffled. Veronica started to speak, but she never got the chance. Rose stood beside the woman in black, stared at Veronica, and snapped that she was acting like a kid. Then Veronica's face flared red with pure embarrassment. Veronica trailed after Rose as Rose announced that Douglas, the bodyguard they'd hired, was their important guest and told Veronica to stop pestering him. Veronica nodded along, and Douglas just stood there in stunned silence, staring off into the distance. As the hours rolled on, Douglas and Ravi sat at the table when a woman in black slid in with tea. Admitting she was sorry for Veronica's behavior, Douglas just shook his head and told her she didn't need to apologize. The woman set the teacups on the table and pressed, "Can we really count on Douglas?" Douglas bowed his head and apologized for turning her down yesterday. Then the woman planted her hands on the table and snapped, "You don't have to apologize." What? The woman's eyes lit up as she remembered Carlos and his crew. Then she admitted it. Carlos had started falling for Rose, and he showed up every single day with one goal in mind, to make her his. Douglas and Ravi slid into their seats and stared at the woman like she held the key. She kept going, warning them that Carlos was brutal to the girls, so they refused to let him near Rose, and that's exactly why he started driving everyone crazy. The woman dropped her elbows on the table and buried her head in her hands. Douglas, though, felt ready to step in for these women. He said he needed a plan to shield them from Carlos, and Ravi shot a tense look at Douglas. The woman jerked up in her chair and snapped that Carlos had started stirring up trouble near the place, but the kids piled in and started hurling trash at the house. Then she and Ted went out to patrol, and Ted wound up getting hurt. The woman grabbed the cup and Robbie stared at her like he was hunting for clues. Then Douglas cut in, asking why they couldn't just stop chasing customers. She shot back that if this didn't get done, every client would vanish, and with them, the money would disappear too. Douglas stared at his wife and realized he could only guard the women for 4 days, because once he was gone, someone like Carlos could show up, and they'd have no one left to protect them. Douglas pressed a hand to his mouth, thinking hard about how he could protect those women. Then a handkerchief dropped from above onto the table, and Douglas and the woman both snapped their heads up in shock. Teddy accidentally dropped the handkerchief on the second floor. It was just sitting there when the woman spotted it. Rage flared, and she snapped that she and Douglas had an important conversation. Meanwhile, it lay on the table, right where it didn't belong. Douglas lit up with an idea, and when the woman stared at him in shock, he pitched it fast. If calling customers from outside was risky, then women could pull them in through the building's windows. The woman snapped back that if the girls yelled at full volume from the windows, it would do the exact opposite, scaring visitors off while blowing the whole neighborhood's piece to pieces. Douglas snatched the handkerchief off the table, flicked it away, and said, "You don't have to touch customers to win them over," making the woman's jaw hit the floor. The woman pushed herself up from her chair and declared, "Let's reel them in with the girl's secret. Her mystery will draw them straight in." Ravi stared at the handkerchief on the table, stunned, then rushed over to Douglas. She was clutching a flower and told him she'd picked it just for him, and Douglas thanked her with a warm grin. Right beside Douglas sat a box packed with sewing supplies, and Ravi perched on the table next to him, gripping a bunch of flowers like she meant every second. She leaned in and asked what Douglas planned to do with the fabric spread across the table. Then Douglas snatched up the scissors and started slicing right through it. Douglas stitched the fabric into a flower, then gathered it into perfect petals. Ravi watched, stunned, as Douglas cupped the finished bloom in his hands. Douglas imagined girls tossing artificial flowers from their windows, and he swore that's how they'd steal everyone's attention. Ravi clutched a flower, and the woman approved the whole idea. Standing beside Ravi and Douglas, the woman nodded and said she could wake the girls so they could come help make the flowers. Douglas said there was no use waking them. Those girls needed to sleep, and he and the rest would handle everything on their own. The woman grinned at Douglas and told him, "You're a good man, and every scrap of this fabric is yours to use." She climbed the stairs like a mission, hunting down even more useless fabric. Ravi stood beside her, gripping a flower, and Douglas did the same. Then he snapped that he had to make even more folds in the fabric, so his flower matched the one Ravi had picked for him. Ravi clutched the flower in her hands and grinned. Then Douglas told her he needed her, and she instantly said yes. Douglas and Ravi snipped, pressed, and stitched fabric together, crafting a whole bunch of faux flowers, and they got so lost in it that nothing else mattered. Night had already swallowed the sky, and right in front of Douglas and Ravi sat a mountain of fabric flowers, too many to count. Douglas rubbed his sore shoulder, worn out to the bone, while Ravi beamed, thrilled with every bit of progress. Ravi dialed Douglas, smiled bright, and told him that soon flowers would rain from the sky, and anyone who saw them would be thrilled. Douglas nodded along, totally on board. In their cozy pajamas, the girls stood on the stairs, staring at the chaos and wondering what Douglas and Ravi were up to, until Ravi caught a sudden surprise, gasped, and tossed flowers up into the air. Douglas jabbed a finger at the flowers, and the girls lit up with pure delight. Then they practically begged to know how to address him. Douglas said, "Call me Douglas," and introduced Ravi too, but the girls were left reeling at everything they just heard. One of them shouted that Douglas was a guardian and an adventurer, scaring Douglas and Ravi half to death, because Douglas had no idea how these girls knew him. Then Ravi scrambled onto Douglas's lap, and the girl declared that Douglas was famous. One of the girls shoved a piece of paper into Douglas's hands, and when he read it, his surprise hit hard. He couldn't make out what it was even trying to say. Douglas stared at the paper, baffled by why it was drawing this much attention, and the girl just shrugged, of course, because he'd already beaten the dragon, while a sleepy Veronica shuffled into the room. The woman in black smirked and said she knew Douglas was good because he'd cracked the problem at Matlock's shelter, but now those same girls were under her control. Veronica went numb hearing it. Douglas just stared at the girls in silence. Douglas grinned, ready to speak, then Veronica cut him off mid-sentence. From across the room, she snapped that he was a hypocrite, proud of good deeds while somehow missing the point, her rage blazing clear on her face. The woman in black snapped with rage and screamed at Veronica to shut up, and the girls froze, staring at Veronica in shock. Douglas stared at Veronica, stunned, and right away she burst into tears and screams, insisting she'd never thank him because it would make him look like he saved her. Veronica bolted out of the room, the girls lunged to stop her, and then, clap, someone snapped their hands together. Every head whipped around in shock at the noise's source. Rose stood on the second floor, and in a sharp snap, she said Veronica had snapped at Douglas. Then she wondered aloud why the flowers were there, and ordered Douglas and Ravi to get out of the room. The very next day, Douglas, Ravi, and Rose were posted outside in the inner garden, and Rose stepped right in front of Ravi and Douglas. She owned up immediately, apologizing for what she did to Veronica yesterday and admitting she'd acted like a kid. Then Douglas stared at Rose, silently taking it all in. Douglas stood face to face with Rose and demanded answers about Veronica being sold at Matlock Orphanage, and Rose couldn't shake the feeling that Douglas was way too invested. Douglas stared forward and snapped, "I have to get the answer to my question," while Rose planted her heels in the ground and fired back that he was carrying way too much, trying to save everyone he met. Rose kept smiling a little and said his thinking was arrogant. Then she insisted he wanted to help people in need, the way a parent shields a child. Douglas stared at Rose in shock. She tapped her waist, smirked, and said she had a child too, born when she was just 15. The little girl's 4 years old now, and she's sitting down for dinner with a whole bunch of other kids in the dining room. Rose stepped aside and told Douglas straight up that he couldn't save everyone who needed help, and that he had no right to stick his nose into other people's business. After thinking it over, Douglas nodded and agreed with her. A gust whipped through, and Douglas blurted that he couldn't turn away while people were hurting. Robbie's hair snapped and fluttered in the wind as Douglas kept going, insisting that if there was even the tiniest shot to save someone, he had to take it. Douglas cups a single flower petal in his hands, stares at it like it holds a secret, and then says, "That's the moment it all started. I became an adventurer for this." Rose brushed her fingers over her face and said Douglas was pure heart, and when Douglas handed the petal to Robbie, he snapped, "Yeah, he's just stubborn." Rose's smile vanished the second she admitted it, just like Douglas feared. Veronica was an orphan who'd been sold off to Matlock Orphanage. It all started when she was just 9, and 6 long years have smashed by since, right as flower petals rained down to the ground. Douglas's jaw fell open as he stood at the table before Rose and blasted the truth. Veronica was only 9 years old. Rose snapped back that Madame was respectable now, but the woman who used to run that place, she was pure trouble. Rose replayed those past days in her head. Veronica was cowering in the stable, tucked beside a haystack, while someone prowled around with a lantern, hunting for her. The girl with that wild hair color towered over Veronica, and Veronica froze in pure terror, because this was the first time she'd ever seen her. The girl slid into the seat beside Veronica, clutching a suitcase, and blurted that she was Veronica's new mentor. While Veronica herself looked badly hurt, the girl then wrapped Veronica's injured hand with a bandage. Veronica's mentor cinched a bow on her hand and growled that girls like her have no escape. She just has to swallow the truth of her situation, because if Veronica wants freedom, she'll have to live right here. The teacher yanked Veronica into a tight hug, and instant tears flooded Veronica's eyes. Rose remembered Veronica's face shifting over time. Then Rose explained how she started hoarding money to run for freedom, and 6 years later, the girls finally got a letter. Veronica stood shoulder to shoulder with the other girls, grabbed the letter, and read it out loud. Detention was illegal, and from that day on, they were finally free. Rose stared at Douglas and told him, "When we first heard the news, we were thrilled," then said Veronica left, only to come back a bit later, and somehow the debts were gone. Rose leaned in and demanded, "So what did Douglas think, and what exactly did Veronica return with?" Veronica hovered at the doorway clutching a suitcase, and when the other girls rushed up, she broke down crying, begging them. She had nowhere left to go. Douglas went totally speechless, clutched his fist, and realized he was 6 years too late, while Rose stared back at him with sharp, curious interest. Rose, Douglas, and Ravi huddled beneath a tree, and Rose blurted out, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have told that story," because it only piled more weight onto Douglas's shoulders. Douglas shot back that he felt trapped by obligation, fighting to help Veronica. Ravi locked eyes with Douglas, and he snapped that he had to talk to Veronica. Rose's eyes flew open wide. She clung to Veronica's words about kindness and helping others, while Douglas and Ravi just stood there, frozen in place. Rose flashed a huge grin that lit up her whole face. Night crashed down as Veronica perched on the building's roof, staring into the nearby houses of the city like she was piecing together something big. She couldn't forget the screams that tore out of her the moment they promised she'd finally meet her real mother, only to watch the truth land like a betrayal, with adults laughing all around her like it was a joke. Veronica jolted awake the second someone shouted her name. She shot to her feet and spotted Douglas and Raffi, then spun around and said, "If Douglas is here to apologize, I'm not going to apologize back." Douglas snapped back that wasn't why he was there, and Veronica shot up, screaming she didn't get it at all. His presence beside her was lighting a fuse, and her fist clenched tight. She slammed her eyes shut and screamed that Douglas couldn't save her or the others, and she snapped that the adults around them did nothing too, even though everyone kept dragging that truth in her face. Ravi was terrified. Right as Veronica wrapped up her words, Douglas shot forward in his seat. Veronica froze, completely lost as he faced her, and he admitted that he and the other adults had failed to save her and the other kids 6 years ago, so when Douglas apologized, Veronica couldn't make sense of it. Veronica leaned in a little, screamed, "I already know everything, I'm just having a tantrum," and then snapped, "So tell me, Douglas, why are you bowing your head?" Douglas stared at the ground in silence, thinking, if I'd been in Addington 6 years ago, I would have saved every kid, but I failed, and the pain of knowing small children were shoved into danger still crushes him, so he begs for forgiveness. Veronica's cheeks flared red, and tears spilled over when Douglas finally admitted he was begging for forgiveness, for failing to save her back then. The apology shattered her, because she couldn't even figure out why he was hurting himself like that. Veronica slumped with tears pouring down her face and whispered that Douglas was talking like this now, but it was already too late, her life was finished. Douglas snapped back that he was sure she still had plenty of chances left. Veronica wiped the tears from her face while Douglas kept talking about all the chances waiting in the world, how she could go anywhere, be whoever she wanted, and when she finally asked if he was preaching to her again, Douglas swept in and stroked her head. She snatched his hand without a clue what he was up to, and when Douglas smiled and said he was only trying to comfort her, Ravi stepped in to comfort Veronica as well, yet Veronica still bristled, furious that everyone kept treating her like she was a kid. Veronica finally let go, pressed her hands against Douglas, and blurted that she had no clue what was going on, because getting comforted when you don't want it. Yeah, that kind of thing is so infuriating. Veronica's sobs burst out as she slumped against Douglas, and he soothed her by stroking her head. Night rolled in and the city streets woke up. Then a girl in a cat costume swept up beside a man, took his hand, and invited him over with a grin, and he smiled right back. A beat later, a single flower drops to the ground, and everyone nearby snaps their heads up. Up on the house balconies, girls hurled objects at the street below and frantically waved their hands at whoever walked past. Everyone around them stared, eyes wide, completely hooked by the jaw-dropping spectacle unfolding before them. On a balcony, Princess Rose stood with flowers in her hair, hands stretched out as she called down to the clients below. The men stared at Rose, totally baffled, while Veronica stood by the house, eyes sharp, watching everyone around her sprint and scramble to snatch up the flowers littering the ground. Veronica stared up as flowers rained down, and there Douglas, Ravi, Madame, and Ted stood right beside her, while Douglas' words echoed in her mind. She could be free and go wherever she wanted. Veronica's lips curled into a smile like she'd just won the game. Veronica kept staring at the drifting petals and blurted, "So, who am I supposed to become anyway?" A few days later, Douglas can't shake it. No matter where he goes or what he does, he feels Veronica's eyes on him, and the second he catches her staring, she explodes into screaming and bolts like he caught her doing something deadly. Douglas just watched Veronica bolt into the night, and something about her felt maddeningly mysterious. Ravi stayed right beside him, helping him wipe everything down, while Douglas rinsed and scrubbed the dishes like he could wash away the moment. This was his last day in the house. Douglas stood beside a furious madam and he demanded answers. Why hire him for such a short stretch? She snapped back that Baron Morse, the ringleader of these hooligans, was coming back tomorrow. A woman puffed on a pipe, stared straight at Douglas, and said Baron Morse was nearby with his men, then warned that if she reported Carlos's moves, the Baron would punish him and leave them alone. Douglas spun back to her and the whole truth finally clicked. Robbie hauled the clean dishes over to Teddy, who was squatting on the spot, and Douglas told Madame that he and Robbie wanted to hand the cursed objects straight to Baron Morse. The woman slammed her phone onto the table and said it wasn't going to happen. No matter how odd he seemed, he wasn't some nobody. Douglas' nerves lit up at once because he knew today was Carlos, one shot to make it count. Douglas and Ravi helped the girls hang out the laundry, and Douglas couldn't stop thinking about Carlos, because the last time he saw him was the day they met at the gate of the house. Then boom, loud sounds tore through the air, and every single person snapped their heads toward the source. Carlos slams his foot through the wooden door, and splinters rain to the floor as he bursts inside where the laundry had been hanging. Then Douglas and Robbie snapped their heads toward him. Carlos stared at Douglas and snapped that it had been days since they last met, then demanded he bring Princess Rose, but Douglas flat out refused, and rage surged through Carlos on the spot. Carlos thrust his arms wide, and scary bandits materialized behind him as he roared, demanding Douglas repeat his answer again. Carlos shot his hand up and declared he'd hired bandits from Balzac, cruel brutes who could take down Douglas, and the girls huddled behind him bolted in panic. Douglas stared ahead and figured Carlos had been unusually quiet for days because he was waiting on reinforcements from Balzac, and when the girls started packing, Douglas barked that they had to slip around back, no one left behind, and Robbie was coming with them. Douglas stepped right up to the bandits and told Carlos, "If you truly like Princess Rose, then back off, because snatching a girl by force is no man's honor." Carlos felt pure embarrassment crash over him the moment he heard those words. Carlos's face turned crimson as he yelled at Douglas to shut up and stop preaching to him, because that's exactly what Justice's father, Baron Morse, had done too. Carlos barked an order at the bandits to take down Douglas, and with weapons in hand, several of them surged toward him. A second later, the bandits dropped like stones, dead still, motionless on the ground. Douglas and Carlos stared at the bandits crumpled on the ground in shock, then Carlos's legs buckled. He staggered and collapsed too. His eyes stayed wide open, stunned, like he couldn't make sense of what had just happened to him. Everyone swore Douglas had wiped out the bandits, but he shot it down fast. He had nothing to do with what happened. Then his eyes locked on a dark silhouette perched on the roof, needle clutched in both hands. A black-haired boy perched on the roof, grinning wide as needles floated around his hand. Then he turned to Douglas and asked if Douglas could see his attack, and Douglas snapped his mouth open in shock. The young man pressed his hands to his chest, then launched off the roof, touching down just a short distance from Douglas. He said his attack moved so fast nobody could even react, and Douglas stared at him like, "This guy is seriously dangerous." A young man drifted around with this unsettling, creepy aura, and Douglas immediately knew he wasn't like anyone he'd met before. Then the guy grinned and said he'd get down to business right now. Bandits closed in behind Douglas, and when they started to rake at him in pain, he spun around. Carlos yelled, "Help me," because Douglas was terrified. Bandits sprawled across the ground as a dark aura choked the air. Then the stranger strode straight up to Douglas and started swinging. Douglas erupted, screaming that this guy had to be stopped, right now. The young man snaps his spell to life, and it rockets toward Douglas. Then a savage wind rips through the area, forcing everyone to stumble back while the girls scramble to cover themselves. Douglas snapped his guard aside so the hit flew away from the girls. The spell smashed into the wall, and boom, an explosion tore through the air. When Douglas glanced back, his stomach dropped because he realized the games were laced with poison magic. The young man rubbed his chin and snapped, "Why is Douglas messing with me? Aren't these bandits supposed to be our enemies?" Douglas stared him down, laser-focused, not once taking his eyes off the stranger. Douglas snapped into a fighting stance, but then he shot back that it wasn't true, because the other guy shoved a hand onto his belt, claiming Douglas was all softness, and swearing that wherever Douglas went, he never fought to kill. Douglas snapped to attention the second he heard it, and the guy kept going, saying that if Douglas could handle whoever stood in his way, he wouldn't bother trying to save Fenrir. Douglas replayed the Fenrir fight in his head, and he couldn't believe it. This guy was still tailing him. Douglas snapped to attention. He wasn't being followed at all, because the stranger's real eyes were locked on Ravi. A creepy stranger loomed in front of Douglas, and the moment hit him, this was real. He spun around and saw Ravi completely frozen, fear ripping through her as she shook uncontrollably, tears of pure horror flooding her eyes. The stranger threw his arms wide and strode straight toward Douglas, then said it felt like Douglas was finally starting to catch on. Douglas just stared back with a hard, serious look. The stranger's face hardened into pure menace, and he snapped that he'd vanish with Ravi right now. Ravi clutched her chest in terror, but Douglas swept his hand in front of her and swore he wasn't about to hand her over. The stranger slammed to a stop. Doug's instincts screamed, because he had no idea who this guy was, yet it was crystal clear. He was Ravi's enemy. The stranger strapped 2 swords to his belt and lifted his hands, smiling like he already knew the end was coming. Then he said he'd start by taking down Douglas. The dark-haired villain grinned wickedly at his opponents, then poison magic surged in his hands, and 3 razor-sharp claws erupted into existence. He swung at Douglas, and Douglas snapped back with a jump just in time, because the second Douglas saw the motion, he realized the attack wasn't meant for them. The needles streaked through the air and slammed straight into the crowd. Douglas snapped his hand upward, eyes locked in fierce focus, then unleashed wind magic. His flow twisted, and he yanked the flying needles off course, slamming them into a whole new direction. Then bam, something snapped his focus, and he whipped his head around just in time to see his comrades crumpled on the ground, utterly still, with their weapons lying right beside them. Turns out his allies were poisoned, and Douglas went, no time to waste. He unleashed his skills at once, using detoxification magic to pull them back. One of the girl's eyes cracked open, and she fought to speak, but all that came out was a flash of unbearable pain. Douglas instantly knew the poison was racing through her, and at this pace it would take a while before it finally cleared. Suddenly, the dark-haired guy surged right up to Douglas, grinning. He knew he could smash through everything by using his skills all at once. Douglas couldn't even believe how he'd slipped this close. Then the dark-haired man swung and snarled that he'd hit his limit, right as the punch slammed into Douglas's head. The man flinched in pure shock, then it hit him. This guy's techniques and physical prowess screamed assassin, and he didn't even need to make a single sound. But for Douglas, this was the real spark. He had to figure out why a monster like that would target Ravi, because that man didn't just attack. He slammed himself in front of her and shielded the girl with his own body. His opponent demanded to know what he'd do next, and Douglas stared back, wiping the blood off his mouth as it dripped there. Then the boy shoved his sword away and warned him that if he didn't smash in one of the magics right now, he wouldn't be able to launch another attack. But if he barges in, those girls who make money the shady way, and the hooligans too, are about to pay a brutal price, and everyone sprawled on the ground is already knocked out. Douglas blasts off air magic again, whipping up wind, while the dark-haired guy sneers like he's just playing guardian for that little girl. The enemy smirked and drawled that he lived for the moment people fall apart in trouble. Then he decided to prove it to the rabbit and show him what the adult world is really like. Douglas swung with raw fury and snapped, "Shut up," because that wasn't what he wanted to show her, yet the man's blow sliced through nothing, and the boy had already yanked himself back with a perfect jump. He sprang into the air and snapped at Douglas, calling him an old man, yelling that he was fuming because he wasn't sure he could hit back with pure indifference, right as the guy pulled his needles out again. Blades started raining out of the sky, and Douglas just couldn't make sense of it, while the girls nearby burst into hiccups and trembled with pure terror, and even then the man still had no clue what was going on. He knew that if he shut off the detoxification magic, Carlos and his friends would vanish, and then he'd be stuck using air magic across the entire sky, while his opponent goaded him, daring him to say who he'd sacrifice. Douglas kept battling, and that guy finally blurted whether he was saving the girls and hooligans, or Ravi. The second the words left his mouth, he was suddenly right behind Ravi and Douglas. Before the assassin could even finish launching his strike, Douglas snapped to attention, instantly clocked the whole setup, and spun toward his opponent, only to see that the blade was already hovering right beside Ravi, and Ravi's shock nearly froze her with her mouth hanging open. A sickening impact echoed, and heavenly blades started raining down from the sky with a blaring ring. Then the assassin smashed straight into Douglas's side, his blade already the wrong color, yet Douglas didn't budge. Suddenly his expression shattered, drops splattered across his armor, and a brutal gash tore through his side where a clone protruded like something wrong from inside. Rafi lunged forward, gripping his hand as she screamed, "Daddy." Douglas yanked the assassin off him with one brutal move, but the guy spun out of it, slipped into a perfect backflip, then landed on the ground and scoffed that protecting someone by sacrificing your own body was just boring to him. Even with his wounds screaming, Douglas kept fighting back with air magic. Then a brutal gust of wind snapped the assassin out of sight, and the blade still stuck in his side flashed into view again. Blood burst from the man's mouth again, and Ravi lunged in right away, panicked about her dad's condition, tears pouring down her face as she kept screaming his name while the blade tore him apart. Her tears splashed onto her father's hand, and he begged her to stop because he wanted to shield her smile. No way was Douglas letting the one person who mattered most to him get hurt. And that's when he vowed to keep his promise at any cost. Lightning crackled in his hands as he unleashed a brutal scream, throwing his opponent completely off guard. The assassin couldn't wrap his head around how Douglas was still brimming with life, even after he drove a knife into his gut. Douglas just stared up at him and snapped that he had someone he had to protect. The guy cut him off mid-sentence and charged straight at the man, snarling that he'd just walk away and leave Douglas without a heart. Then he exploded forward, pushing off the ground and jumping again. But he wouldn't quit. He kept gathering power in his hands, pushing through to finish the sentence that dared to break his limits, and then he unleashed the god of wrath's lightning-commanding power. He demanded his rage be unleashed and snapped, calling on the thunderclap power. Then the assassin went wide-eyed, stunned he could cast another spell because he was convinced that kind of magic just wasn't possible. Douglas burst in blinding light, shouted that he'd triggered triple skill use, then thrust his hand at the ground and unleashed his lightning magic thunder. The assassin was launched skyward and then dropped with a dull, soft thud, while Ravi knelt at her side and called her dad again, only for him to sway and plead, "Stay right where you are." Before anything else, he had to rip the poison out of himself, so he slammed detoxification magic onto his own body, then immediately thrust his hand toward his former opponent, and Douglas once again unleashed simultaneous skills. The assassin crumpled in silence, trapped in Starlight's shackles when the boy snapped awake, grabbed him, and a cold plan hit. He'd try to destroy him. Douglas snapped to it. The enemy had already come back to his senses. He leaned in and warned he'd hand the assassin straight to the military police. With venom in his voice, the assassin muttered that this was bad news already, because his employer was going to lose his mind. The man hunted for who his employer really was and why they were hunting Ravi the assassin, until Ravi shot back that he should have asked the rabbit. Douglas shot the man a sharp look at that little girl hiding a mountain of secrets, and irritation burned in his chest as he tried, really tried, not to hear a single word from him. The girls behind him sprinted up to Ravi, but Douglas barely even looked their way, just enough to decide he needed to shut this conversation down for now. Douglas spun to face the girls, going straight to Veronica and everyone else, demanding to be sure no one was hurt. Then he bowed his head and begged for forgiveness, pleading with them to look after Carlos and the others, and she agreed. The assassin sprawled on the ground, lightning flickering as he stared at his tied hands. Right beside him, the guy muttered that he was sorry, because it all ended up as his failure. Just then the boy slipped his hands behind his back, leaving Douglas baffled, and before anyone could even react, the assassin launched into whatever he had planned. Suddenly the bracelet around his wrist snapped in half. Douglas froze, staring, because the assassin had a knife tucked in his heel. And then his hands finally broke free. At the exact same moment, he sprang back and started saying goodbye to the man. The assassin flashed that nasty grin and declared that Douglas owed him for those hands. The guy had already leapt onto the roof and vanished, while Douglas screamed for him to stop, until the man yanked his side, bleeding all over again. The man was ready to fire off his healing skill again, and Ravi sprinted straight toward her dad, desperate to yell at him, because she was terrified he'd get hurt. Total darkness swallowed everything. Douglas blinked awake in his bed, and when he lifted his eyes, he saw another bed hanging above him, but the room was dead silent and he was totally alone. Douglas jolted upright in bed, staring around like he'd been yanked through a portal, because this was the same room in the prostitute's house where he and Ravi were staying. Suddenly, Ravi burst out from behind the door, grinning as she called out to him. Then the man snapped his name back and instantly winced in pain. The girl begged her father, "Don't move, please," warning him the doctor's stitches on his wound could rip open, and Douglas just stared, utterly confused. Ravi tried to say Dad had a brutal wound, but they told him no healer in this town was good enough. Then Douglas lifted his shirt and revealed the stitches. He finally got it. If you can fix brutal wounds just by stitching them, the heroes group could earn a living doing it for everyone. The man started stroking the girl's hair and admitted he must have scared her. Then he leaned in to soothe her, telling her he was okay now, while he powered up full restoration on himself. Right then the man snapped at Robbie to watch that seam, because it was gone, and Douglas instantly said he felt better already. The girl lit up, begging to know if it hurt, and he grinned and swore it didn't, until the man's face suddenly twisted in shock. Turns out that little girl broke down in tears, because when she saw him finally better, pure relief hit her like a wave. Tears poured from her wide, childish eyes, and she kept whispering the same words again and again. Douglas yanked Robbie's face toward him, wiping salty tears off her cheeks and begging her, "Don't cry." Then, click, the door snapped open and a man stepped in. Voices spilled in right away, and Robbie realized he'd finally come to his senses. Crowds crowded the doorway as the lead representative told Douglas, "You've slept for over a day." Douglas snapped his gaze toward the woman. A woman cut him off and dragged him back to yesterday because her girls, Carlos, and his friends were all okay. Turns out it was Douglas who made it happen. Meanwhile, the assassin was getting chased by the military police, but it looked like they still hadn't nailed him. The guest house lady kept going, saying the military police needed Douglas for questioning about the dark man. Then Douglas snapped his head up in shock and demanded again. He said they weren't just being nosy, they wanted to know who he was and what really happened during the attack. At least it sounded like they wanted Douglas to spill what he knew, and now they were straight up watching his house. She apologized, then promised she'd call them. Douglas forced an awkward grin, stuck with almost nothing about this guy, just one brutal fact: he was an assassin and his target was Ravi. At that exact moment, the girl clutched her father's hand, and her whole body started shaking violently. Ravi stood beside Douglas, watching in silence, waiting for him to finally talk. Douglas shot her a quick, furtive glance, then started speaking. First, he threw out an apology and admitted that even though the wound had closed, everything that happened left him wiped out. Then he started thinking about meeting the military police tomorrow, and the guesthouse owner agreed. Suddenly it hit her, she remembered everything, and when she told the story about how, right after she came back, Baron Morse found out what Carlos had done, the man froze in pure shock. The lady flat out told him that from now on, he'd have to shadow the Baron on every single journey, because with his father watching him nonstop, there'd be no more chances to stir up trouble. She told him she'd also warned the Baron that Douglas planned to come see him, and the man grinned, saying she'd just turned him into her debtor. He was thrilled for a second, but the truth hit hard: he'd never get to meet Baron Morse. So he snapped his gaze to Ravi and demanded she tell the military police everything about that man. Ravi spun around, totally lost. She still couldn't figure out what he wanted, and Douglas snapped that he never meant it like that. He meant she shouldn't do it at all. The man kept pushing, saying all she had to do was tell him plainly whether she was against it, and that would be enough for him. Ravi went quiet for a beat, then admitted she was terrified, so Douglas snapped, urging her to flee at once. She stared him down, completely lost, not understanding a single thing that was happening. Douglas promised he'd write a letter so Madame and the others wouldn't be bothered once everyone was gone. Then he snapped, "Robbie, get ready." And Robbie nodded along as her father drilled into them to vanish from the military police's sight. A bunch of people loomed outside, and Douglas watched from behind the door, counting every breath, trying to slip past the military police without getting caught. Suddenly a voice snapped from behind them and froze the people just as they were about to leave, demanding they wait. It was Veronica, telling them to stop acting so unfriendly. The man stared at the girl, totally confused, then she blurted, "We're here," and insisted she was right nearby, and the military police just snorted at him, since he'd convinced himself they wouldn't spot him. Madame whipped around to Douglas and said they might need to step in and decide. A cart rolled up to the house, and it was the same man who brought their alcohol and food every night. Madame had already talked to the coachman, so he'd drive them straight to the outskirts of the city. Douglas warned that she'd get pulled into it, but Madame cut in fast and said, "Hand it to me." She reminded him he was the guardian, so he should always pick the safest route. Then she cleared everything up with him, and Douglas finally agreed. Ravi could have been hauled into custody, but Douglas stepped in, and now the girls in the guest house can work without fear. Madame even added that they'd use the flowers he made for them with care, then told them to take care of themselves too. Carlos thanked him for saving him that day, swearing he'd never forget their kindness. The girl beamed, saying that was the first time she'd ever met someone this kind, and begged for the chance to thank him again the next time they came. Right then she said it was only natural. While the little girl slipped a flower behind her ear, Ravi reached up to fix it, and as soon as he smiled, the girl smiled right back. Someone stepped up and told him, "You still don't know if you should keep living," and that hit like a punch. Now he'd actually take it seriously, because he was done with the anger he'd carried about the past, and he'd finally stare down the future and figure out what to do next. Veronica lit up with a smile and promised, "When that day finally comes, we'll meet again, and I'll look you in the eye proud that we haven't seen each other in ages." Even the family packed into the cart cheered right along with her. Those few days with them had been nothing but non-stop smiles, and when they finally had to leave, everyone yelled at them to take care, while deep down they prayed they'd run into Douglas and Ravi again soon. The man and his daughter beamed as they finally stared at the house where they'd spent days hauling everything out, and then night swallowed the streets as they drove out of the city, until the boys hopped down from the cart. The cart rattled off into the darkness, and Douglas and Robbie kept rolling down the wide, tree-lined roads, while the dead of night swallowed every sound except the quiet footsteps of two people. The man promised them things would finally be okay, said the next major city they'd hit was Baltsac, and warned that a soft bed was off the table for a long time. Then the girl, with a heavy heart, nodded along. Under the moonlit canopy, the two of them kept moving down the path, and as Ravi's thoughts spiraled, he begged forgiveness to her father, because it was all her fault they'd been forced to flee the city in a rush. She also mentioned the dark man. She knew she had to tell everything, but fear locked her tongue, and even Douglas thought maybe he hadn't meant for her to push herself to talk. Ravi snatched her clothes and blurted that she wasn't dangerous, swearing that if her father stayed with her, disasters would come crashing down on them. And it all started because she was a cursed child, so the dark people hauled her in as bait for demons. The moment they came for her, the girl broke down, tears pouring as her face twisted with a whole storm of emotions. Douglas kept repeating her words about the cursed child, but the moment she mentioned dark people, his mind screamed destroyers, and then the girl started trembling and fear hit him hard. He rushed to steady her, insisting everything was fine and begging her to stop worrying. Ravi tried to object, but the man cut her off and told her he was thrilled she'd finally opened her heart to him, just as long as she didn't feel like she had to force it. Douglas told her, "Stop drowning in guilt, just keep your secrets if you have to, and when you're ready, let me hear you. I'll take whatever you tell me." Ravi spun to his father with pure relief. She went quiet for a beat, then flashed a smile and said she agreed, but when she thanked him, he immediately sensed it was a smile she didn't really mean. Because the day they first met, Ravi told her she had nowhere left to go, so he vowed, "Don't worry, I'll take you to Baltsac and find someone there who'll take care of you." He couldn't shake the question, did Ravi really think she'd be watched, when they hadn't even settled the exterminator incident yet? Douglas snapped his head to the girl and told her she was about to vanish the second he left her with someone, Balzac, and the poor girl went white, mouth falling open in pure shock. He finally got it, Ravi really wouldn't hurt a fly, and no way could he picture her yanking anyone into this mess, especially when she's this terrified and still stuck carrying everything on her own. He stared down at her, dropped to his knees to meet her eyes, and blurted out an apology before begging her to hear the words he'd always wanted to say, and it totally blindsided her. Douglas promised he'd hand Ravi off to someone's care once they hit Baltsac, then, right when it mattered, he snatched that plan back because he'd been wrestling with the decision the whole time. Long journeys weren't fit for a little kid. She deserved a calm city, packed with children her own age, and Douglas was certain she'd learn things he could never teach her. So he kicked things off by claiming he was just a middle-aged drifter, saying he had no clue how to raise kids, and not the faintest idea what girls were really feeling. But he couldn't shake one truth, he wanted her smiling, and at last he pushed the question out, or really, he pleaded for Ravi to become a real member of his family. Then the girl opened her mouth and shocked him. Her eyes went wide, she sucked in one huge breath, and her voice broke as she blurted that if he stayed near her, her dad would be in serious trouble. Then Douglas just said, "He'll be fine." He couldn't stop himself, he had to hear what Ravi truly wanted. The girl snatched her clothes back once more, and a crushing sadness flooded her as she admitted she just wanted to stay with her father forever. Douglas swore that no matter who the enemy was, he'd shield her with everything he had, so she didn't have to fear a thing, because he was going to turn Ravi into the happiest girl on the whole planet. Ravi burst into tears and spun toward her father, then threw herself into his arms and squeezed him tight like she'd never let go, and Douglas lit up with a smile as he wrapped her up just as hard. Because in that moment on that day, they finally became a real family, ending one chapter and starting a new life for a middle-aged man and his beloved daughter. That same night, they hurried down the path as the evening slipped away, fingers locked tight because joy had finally won. Then they set their sights on the next city, the megalopolis of Baltsac, while the wind kept raging on. Footsteps thudded closer, then something on the ground flared bright as the sun. Robbie's eyes lit up in pure delight, convinced it was ice, while Douglas burst out laughing and swore it looked exactly like ice. Still, it wasn't just any stone, it was pure white limestone, and the moment the girl saw it, she gasped in awe. The beauty of that rock hooked her instantly, and in the same breath they both blurted, "This place is amazing, we found a cave." "What?" He told me it's a limestone cave, built from limestone that rain, groundwater, and other watery forces slowly wash away over the years. Ravi kept repeating his words, shocked that the water managed to erase such a huge hole, and her father nodded, saying it took countless long years for it to finally happen. The girl kept staring at the limestone rock, stunned by how incredible it was, while Douglas watched her with a real, warm smile. Later, he pushed for a quick break and even suggested they steep that herbal tea they'd grabbed from Theo's grandfather's shop, while Ravi, on the edge of the moment, kept pressing him to be absolutely sure. He nodded and said that since Milton was so far away, they didn't need to rush anymore. Then, boom. A vicious roar ripped through the cave, and Douglas froze, throwing his hands over his daughter to shield her. He realized those weren't just any rocks, they were falling ones, and he couldn't resist checking what was beyond, so he motioned for Ravi to follow him. She agreed instantly, shaking with fear. Douglas shouted for light, and a blazing orb lit up exactly where they stood. Then eerie whispers started spilling out of the dark. Far off, a giant, shadowy silhouette towered in the distance, blasting eerie sounds into the air, until the boys finally realized it was a colossal bird staring right at them, screeching again and again without ever taking its eyes off. Douglas never saw this coming. A rare tricolor garrow, a magical bird, fluttered into view, blazing with beauty even in the dark, but something about it felt off, like it wore the wrong face. Robbie spotted the bird's injury, snapped his finger toward something nearby, and then, right as those falling rocks started to clatter, he vowed he'd heal her immediately. Doug unleashed full healing, and the bird shot its head up at once. Then it pushed itself onto its feet as Doug kept his hand there, pumping healing until it was fully restored. The bird burst into a bright glow, and two people stared at it like it was magic. Douglas's jaw dropped because it wasn't just three colors, it was a full-on rainbow. It chirped upward, then launched into the air, blasting every rainbow shade across the cave and lighting the whole place up. Douglas stared at the bird and swore nothing could match it, like a brand new species had hatched inside this cave on its own. Ravi exhaled with relief, thrilled that she was finally healthy again. She spun toward her father and blurted that she felt the exact same rush she did when he saved her. Douglas dropped into a squat, staring as his daughter watched the bird vanish into the sky, eyes wide with pure awe. The man grinned, seeing Robbie light up with joy, because it had been a month and a half since they met, and yep, that meant at least 4 months had gone by since he left Baltsac. Before he officially hooked up with Alon and the rest, Douglas traveled with them, and he still vividly remembered this. Right before they took off, there was one question he just couldn't stop himself from asking. He was dying to find out what happens if a wild monster suddenly shows up in front of them, only this time it's calm, not hostile. So, how would they react, and what would they do next? The crowd he faced just stared back, confused, because peaceful monsters sounded like a joke to them. One person even snapped that Douglas must have meant they should show mercy to monsters. The last of the 4 boys snapped back that he was wrong, because all 4 of them were ready to smash that monster for the sake of the future. Ravi yanked him out of his thoughts, distracting him when she spotted a runaway feather, and there she was, grinning as she held that long, colorful find, saying it looked like the bird had thanked them. Douglas sat in silence, his mind racing. Tomorrow they'd hit Baltsac, and if they were still there, he'd finally hand Alan back this ring, the one tied to his parents and the spark that set his curse in motion. And yeah, he even feared he'd never be able to untangle his feelings, because deep down, he was certain they wouldn't be thrilled to see him again. Douglas stared at his hand. Alan's ring sat there, heavy with meaning, because he couldn't waste a second and had to get it back to him. They burst into the city, and Douglas's brain instantly short-circuited. Street panels showed him and Robbie with their arms wrapped around them, and everywhere he turned, people wore masks stamped with his face. Then he spotted those sweets too, cookies plastered with his own face, and suddenly the whole place went loud with voices, but Douglas had no clue why everyone was losing it. Ravi said the cookies with her dad's face were adorable, then told Douglas to stay hands off. Suddenly, people spotted Douglas and blurted his name in disbelief. No one saw his return coming, until the whole town erupted in joyful shouts that Douglas was finally back. Ravi snapped with fear and leapt onto her father's neck, and he just stood there stunned, totally clueless. Then someone yelled that he was the strongest adventure guardian and demanded to know what he thought after spotting the title on his article. The man claimed he was a reporter from the Kashi Mashi Magic Printing House. Then he blurted the word mirror at the top of his lungs. He couldn't stop wondering how it all would play out, because ever since his articles, the whole city has been buzzing his name. And tomorrow, on the front page of the suburban paper, the adventurer's strongest guardian is set to come roaring back. He kept yelling, desperate to hear what he thought, because the newspaper sales would skyrocket again for sure. And when Douglas stared at him in pure shock, Ravi, perched on his arms, went completely scared. A reporter barked at him to spill his travel stories, and suddenly the crowd turned, because they clocked the adventurer's daughter as the reason he'd become a guardian, and someone even shouted that hair so light-like that was unheard of. Douglas snapped into apologies because his daughter was starting to panic, then told everyone to step back, while Robbie clung tighter and tighter to her father's shoulder, trying to disappear behind him from the crowd. Fans kept yelling for his autograph, all because some random, close friend claimed a connection, or a guy swore he'd sat beside him in a tavern once, and Douglas realized they had absolutely no shame. Things were spiraling fast, and he had to escape right now, so he flashed his charm, begged it to blur reality, and left the people in front of him completely baffled. Ravi snapped an illusion into place, and smoke exploded around him on the spot. Ravi loved it, absolutely blown away, until the fog swallowed them head to toe and finally hid them from everyone's eyes. The crowd didn't get what was happening, then the smoke finally faded, and everyone stared in shock as it was just gone. Some people clocked it for what it was, one of Douglas's insane skills, and the way they'd seen it for the first time hit them like a punch. The reporter kept insisting this had never happened before, because their legendary hero didn't just return, he actually showed off his skills right there, bragging that the newspaper kept a full record of every event of the day and charged just 2 copper coins to sell it. Right then the reporter dropped to the ground and got trampled in the chaos, all because everyone was hunting for the adventurer with his daughter and demanding he show up again, while crowds screamed his name and surged forward to reach him before anyone else. Right then on that silent, empty street, Ravi fought to spot her father. She reached out into the air and called to him. Then he snapped back that he'd used illusion magic to mask their bodies, and they bolted away in seconds. He figured she couldn't see him anymore, begged for forgiveness anyway, and asked her to wait just a bit longer. Then the empty street exploded with loud footsteps from people you couldn't even spot. Either way, he was crushed by how badly he scared her, but she waved it off and insisted she was fine, then admitted she was happy her dad was famous. Douglas froze, because even though he'd heard about that newspaper story in Milton, he never in a million years could have guessed where it would all end up. So yeah, the folks in Baltzak were just blowing things up out of pure curiosity, but if they don't calm down, this turns into a real disaster, and he can't even wrap his head around how anyone survives the chaos. Robbie said she had an idea to disguise themselves. Then Douglas pressed her again and they bolted straight to a shop. Right away, the same doorbell chimed and the guy behind the counter greeted them. Welcome. Just then the seller jerked her head left and right like she was hunting for a buyer. And right as that happened, Douglas and Ravi burst into view, grabbed her attention, and apologized for the wait, saying they were here. The girl went wide-eyed with fear and rocked in her chair like she couldn't stay still. A loud crash ripped through the store when the salesman toppled off his chair. Douglas shot over the counter, staring to see if she was okay, and the girl on the floor burst into laughter, practically beaming as she said she was glad to see him. She told me it had been forever since they last saw each other, and she lit up when she realized he was still alive, because lately, not a single day had gone by without rumors flying about him. Then she clocked the girl beside him and instantly figured she had to be his daughter. Rathai stepped in, introduced herself, and lit up, saying she was thrilled to meet her. Then the saleswoman smiled right back and said the very same thing. The same saleswoman jumped straight into business, asking what he needed today, and Douglas practically breathed out in relief because she wasted no time, admitting they'd need a disguise, and she even snatched the curtains right away, getting the whole plan instantly. It made total sense. He couldn't even stroll down the street in peace anymore, and she started pitching him hats or wigs when things got weird. Ravi jumped in too, handing the father a mustache, and even the girl at the cash register gushed that it was just so sweet of her. The girl with glasses told Douglas they had even more, and when she offered him a shot, he agreed without thinking. Then the mirror flipped and a totally different guy stared back, a mustache, a wig, a hat, and clothes that were nothing like his. The saleswoman lit up and said he looked amazing, like his wild musician grandpa. Ravi shrank with fear and blurted that it wasn't their dad, and Douglas just stared at her with a quiet sadness, thinking it over. He spotted a few flasks on the table and shot the saleswoman a question. She grinned and said it was a magic gadget that could flip your hair color for a full 24 hours. And bad luck for him, there's only one dye, the one that instantly turns everything black, so using it is pointless. She snapped to the idea right away. This could help Ravi, but she still had to ask, was he truly sure he didn't want to disguise her? Douglas shook his head and said he didn't want her to hide at all. He couldn't help thinking about it since they'd called her by name earlier, praising her beautiful blonde hair, and he just couldn't believe anyone would actually chase a little girl like that. Ravi glanced at her hair, then snapped her gaze to her father, who instantly met her eyes, and she told him, if I use it, my hair will turn the same color as yours. Douglas went crimson and Lola clapped a hand over her mouth, mortified. The man spun to the saleswoman and declared he'd take it. She thanked him on the spot. Then he pressed, asking if she knew where Alan's group was, and Lola understood he was hunting them down. The man snapped back that it wasn't true. He hadn't even tried to reach them to get back into the group, and Lola burst out laughing as she said, that's not what I meant, claiming she just thought it was better he didn't have to deal with the hero's crew. He finally looked happier, but then too bad. The crew stayed in Baltzak, and a few days ago they vanished. Right to the bitter end, he tried to stop her from blurting it out. They were going to finish off the Demon King. Lola said it looked bleak, because the guild still hasn't gotten a single request to take down the Demon King, and right now the only rumors going around are that they've sunk into despair and already had to bolt. Honestly, she felt a huge wave of relief once they were gone, and Douglas pressed her again, stunned by what she said, because she swore they'd turned into the roots of every awful piece of bad news. Right after Douglas leaves, Dario from the heroes team starts piling up debts everywhere, so fast that everyone turns on him, and even the merchants are suddenly stuck in a nightmare of their own because the guy can't believe he's having money trouble at all. Because even with requests piling in lately, they keep falling flat every time. On top of that, the supplies they're using cost a fortune, so the whole thing spirals into a massive money disaster for everyone. Lola said that was probably the spark behind the fight because the whole team was seconds away from shattering, and then Douglas threw his mouth wide open and screamed. He couldn't believe what he'd just heard. The girl didn't stop. She snapped that Dario's screw-up was the real reason, because he played boss, shoved his own interests forward, and forced the team into a full-on attack-focused makeover. She also heard Dario snap that Alan should kick Fanny out, because she's a healer, and in a fight she can't do a thing. Back when that man was still in the team, Alan's crew hit the field with real power. Edmund the Sage and Fanny, the healer, held the back, while in front you had Alan himself, plus the sorcerer and Dario, the kamikaze swordsman. Douglas said he'd heard all about Dario's claims against Fanny back then, but they still needed someone like him on the team. Lola shot back, he's right. But Dario, drunk out of his mind, snapped in a rage and yelled that Fanny was useless. Alan exploded and kicked him out on the spot. Dario didn't want to be chosen, so he clashed with Alan and it spiraled into a brutal shouting match. Douglas just stood there stunned, repeating her words over and over as the chaos hit. And turns out, what they were hearing in that carriage back then was exactly this. Even after everyone teamed up to take down the Demon King, every squad still needs one good-hearted person to step in and smash the arguments before they explode. Lola pushed on and swore they couldn't shove aside something that important, because even if it starts out fine, trouble crawls in and takes over, and Douglas couldn't stop thinking about that good man. Lola's suspicions got confirmed. When they brushed Alan off, his whole group started crumbling, and that's when Douglas stepped in like he had nothing to fear. He thanked her, then sank right back into his thoughts. Maybe still he has zero clue about the curse, if that's even why. Right then, Ravi yanked her father's clothes away because she swore these people were hurting him. Ravi puffed her cheeks. Douglas burst into laughter, and then, when Lola blurted out like everything had exploded, he spun back to her, desperate for more than just Dario, and she said there was about Alan. Douglas leaned in, hungry for the truth, and the girl warned him that rumors were flying everywhere. She didn't know what was real and what was pure nonsense. They claimed he was sick, weak, and somehow not himself, like even the guy's pale face and hollow, empty eyes proved he couldn't possibly be normal. He took her words in, and for a second he felt completely lost afterward. But back when they last saw each other, none of that ever crossed his mind, so now he couldn't stop chasing what had happened to her over those last few months. And now in the tavern, the night's singing kept rolling, right up until the next day when Douglas and Ravi sat down at a table set. Then the man finally stepped out from behind the counter, and the door creaked as it swung open. It was Achab, the innkeeper, and he straight up apologized because he couldn't make it yesterday. Then he finally swung by after a long time, taking the moment to drop in. Duckley spun to the innkeeper, begging for forgiveness for how abruptly he'd barged in, promising he'd keep things calm from here on out. Then Icab told him he could stay as long as he liked. Right when Douglas finally hit his stride and became famous, the streets filled with a sketchy crew of so-called friends. Now they're just a hassle for the townspeople, and yeah, he just laughed at that whole description of himself. Right then a voice from behind the door shouted, "I'm home." And when the door swung open, Diana, Achab's daughter, stood there smiling from ear to ear as she greeted Ravi, and Ravi happily greeted her right back. Achab's daughter blurted that it was pouring outside and asked if tomorrow would finally give them a break, while Douglas' daughter said it'd be amazing if the rain stopped. Behind the counter, the girls' fathers beamed with real smiles. Then Icab caught wind of it and declared he should be happy now that he finally had a family to care for, and Douglas nodded along with a cheerful grin. Ravi's painfully shy around strangers, so he fretted that she wouldn't click with Ahab's daughter, but slowly, time proved him wrong, and she started opening up to real-life connections. Douglas let out a breath of relief that Ravi had finally clicked with someone her own age, and right then voices echoed up the stairs. Icab snapped that the guests were coming down. He told Diana to get her mother, and she nodded fast. Douglas snapped that it was time to head out, then started slipping into his disguise, ordering Robbie to grab that powder. Everett didn't get a thing about this outfit, and Diana burst into loud, unstoppable laughter. The dining room was packed and buzzing with everyone chatting about their own little world, while Robbie, hair black as midnight and a gorgeous bow perched on top, turned to her father like, "Okay, what's going on here?" And he couldn't help but wonder the same thing. While they ate dinner, Ravi pressed Douglas for answers. Were they leaving this city or not? Douglas paused and waited because this spot was never meant to last, and with all the traveling they'd done, getting used to moving on had just become her new normal. From this moment on, he'd live with Ravi, and the next big call was theirs: keep chasing the road or stop, breathe, and build a real family life. Before anything else, he needed to hear it straight from Ravi. Did she want travel or city life? She froze, didn't know what to say, and finally snapped her gaze to her father, who told her that if she kept traveling, she'd meet all kinds of people, learn new things, and that right there was what made her so captivating. With a home, you've got a place to come back to, and that solid sense of safety lets you live carefree, like you can finally exhale. And then there's Alan, the hero who he keeps talking about because Alan has something vital for him. If he can, he wants to hand it back in person, but he might not make it back to this city, so he begs her to hang in there. Ravi agreed, and Douglas told her to use this time to figure out her next move, then sit down together and decide what they'd do next. Ravi grinned and agreed right away. Out of nowhere, a box barreled up to them, snapping Douglas and Ravi's attention. Then Diana burst out, whipped around, and faced Ravi. Douglas' daughter didn't get why Icab's kid was hiding, and Diana ordered her to keep completely out of sight. Diana crouched under the box and told Ravi, "Go play the moment it's all cleared up tomorrow." Then she held her breath for his reply. Ravi hesitated, unsure if she really meant it, and Diana just smiled like, "Yes," and agreed right away. Rathai suddenly clocked it and blurted out an apology to Diana, worried it would be better if they stayed home. Then Diana shook her head and told her, "Okay, then we'll play with dolls tomorrow." Diana waved goodbye, then scrambled back under the box while Douglas and his daughter waved back too. Meanwhile, the man had a question on his mind, asking his daughter if she wanted to play with Diana outside, and Ravi instantly agreed. But she couldn't ignore what happened last time, the brutal showdown with that assassin, so she snapped out of it, tossed the idea aside, and refused to go through with it. Douglas clocked that she was bringing up the destroyer incident, so yeah, it would have been simple to keep her safe by banning her from going out to play, but he couldn't keep barging into her private life. He finally got the chance to be her friend, so now he's determined to do something about it. Night has fallen, Robbie's knocked out cold, and the tavern still roars with noise as anicap turns away and slides a drink to a customer. He slid up to Douglas with a drink in hand, but the man waved it off. Everything was fine. Still, you could tell he was locked in his thoughts, like something was gnawing at him. Douglas shrugged and said it wasn't a big deal. He just wanted to know if there was a safe way to kill time, because what if Robbie got hit by the destroyer while he wasn't there? Ikov shot a mocking question about the destroyer, brushing off what felt like way too much concern. Then Douglas hit back with total seriousness and stared straight at the table. On the table sat all kinds of magical gadgets, and Douglas's mind was already sprinting. He figured he needed something that could shield Ravi while he was gone, ideally, a way to get a cuckoo. Icab swore he'd found some magical anti-crime cuckoo, but Douglas shut it down fast, explaining it would sniff out danger, warn instantly, and repel trouble on the spot, making it the perfect spell to shield kids when their parents were gone. Icab snapped that he'd been pushing too hard, that this wasn't about showy power, it was a safeguard for people who truly matter, the kind so rare only a few master craftsmen can even build the things. Then Douglas fired back, saying there's one place that knows everything about it. The man was completely stunned by Douglas's plan, because he was about to head straight to the Baltzek shop of magical instruments, aka the secret shop of magical instruments, while Douglas just smirked and swore he'd be back in a flash. Craftsmen forge magical tools as powerful support items, letting adventurers unleash all kinds of effects in the heat of battle. Baltzek's shop of magical instruments is the place to go for items so rare and pristine they feel almost unreal, and it's the most famous magical shop in the whole country. Douglas trekked through the dead quiet, locked on the weird way this shop picked its people, and then right in front of him, two towering pillars waited two brutal totems. He dragged his hand over the nearest one, leaned toward the gatekeeper, and barked for him to wake up and take Douglas's challenge. Smoke started to crawl up behind the gate like the place itself was answering. A voice blasted out from the pillar, stunned to see the client show up so late, and it warned him that only a chosen warrior can step through his summoning gate, so it demanded he prove he really had the power. Douglas stayed totally calm and said the gatekeeper was weaving a special kind of magic, one that only let in the people who cleared every test he'd set up for the shop. He remembered the last time Legionnaire ants everywhere, and now a whole squad of golems was waiting for him, but the gate cut in fast. These weren't ordinary golems, they were 100 demonic mineral constructs, strong enough to stand out even among unique minerals. If he wanted to break free, it had to be right now, because when a body like that unleashed its power, the fist impact was on a whole other level than any ordinary golem. Douglas charged into the fight, snapped a thank you to the gate for the warning, and leapt off the ruined stones already chewed up by 100 golems. Then he threw up a magical barrier. The gate snapped awake. It wasn't just a door, it was a magical barrier, and it warned that Golem's hits were only half the story. Pure brute force won't touch them when magic comes into play. Right then, a shimmering barrier slammed into place over the pillars, and the voice sounded utterly lost, like it couldn't believe what just happened. They wanted answers about what he was up to, but Douglas snapped that the barrier wasn't guarding him. It was guarding the gate from his strike, and when the voice from the gate pressed him, it revealed the truth. He leaned in and realized the attacker was Douglas. Before the gate could even finish opening, he shot back that his daughter was waiting, so he decided to go all in right now. He fired off his fire magic and the salamander spell, and the entire sky erupted in blazing light. Douglas's face burned with pure confidence. The man kept his hand locked in place, forcing the flames to roar harder. Then the fire surged into the golems and wiped them out one after another. A deafening roar tore through the air, and the 100 golems crumpled into a heap of sizzling, charred coals. Douglas finally let out a breath and declared he'd done it. Then the voice from the gate snapped, calling him an imp, because it never crossed his mind anyone would clear the test this fast. The gate even thanked him for slapping up that barrier, and then a bright glow started to bloom in the middle, right on the store's emblem. Whoever was on the other side couldn't wrap their head around it. The challenge gate had just been crushed faster than anyone in history, and if it was passed that easy, didn't it risk ruining the shop's spotless reputation? Douglas stepped up, greeted the owner, and admitted they hadn't seen each other in ages. Then he froze. Right in front of him stood Esther and Carrie, the owners of Balzac's magical instrument shop, and their faces lit up in shock because Douglas was the last person they expected to show up. They all jerked their heads at once, stunned by his insane strength, while the girls' confidence wobbled, but Douglas being Douglas made it feel believable. And honestly, only idiots had been showing up here lately, and they were sure he'd even lost his card. Douglas bragged that it was in his possession, but how were they supposed to prove it was expired, when it had been 3 whole years? The girls snapped into action, racing to fix the expiration date, and the card burst to life as Douglas shot his eyes upward. From the card upward, letters started to bloom out, and this shop was so mesmerizing he didn't even want to blink. Next time, he swore he'd bring Ravi. He was sure she'd love it here, so they handed him a card. Esther told him next time just flash the card at the gate and you'll get in, and Carrie figured he was there only to renew his membership, maybe grab something too, while Douglas shrugged and said he'd do the shopping another day. And he decided to hunt down any magical anti-crime cuckoos and find out the price, so the girls told him he'd have to order one. They could set him up, but it was brutally expensive. 100 gold coins, enough to buy him a mansion. Douglas had to take those high-paying quests no matter what because there was literally no other option, and honestly, it was a small price to keep Ravi safe. He told the girls to book him, said he'd circle back later, and made it clear they'd handle everything. And now a lone figure shows up on that empty street, and tell me, who in their right mind would rush toward those high-paying jobs that can kick off the very next morning? Right in front of him, a tired reporter burst out shouting about a massive explosion in the wastelands, and he couldn't stop wondering if he'd been chasing all this for nothing. Then he finally spotted Douglas, and it turned out Douglas was the mirror from Kahimashi's magical printing house. The reporter's jaw dropped. He'd charged straight into Balzac's shop of magical instruments, even smashing through the summoning gate, and honestly, the reporter hadn't expected anything less from him. But Douglas let his guard slip because it was the dead of night. Now's the moment he's finally going to tell her the truth. He begs her for forgiveness and pleads with her to stop chasing him, because with that physique out in the open, he can't keep hiding from the townspeople anymore, and it's dragging him straight into trouble. That reporter had no clue what he was even saying, because he didn't realize just how special Douglas Ford really was, the one-of-a-kind guy everyone couldn't ignore. And once people finally caught on, they started snapping awake, rushing to their windows and staring out like, wait, that's Douglas. The reporter cornered him for an exclusive interview, and if he said yes, he'd finally see how deeply the whole town adored him. Because one day it wouldn't just be questions and praise, it would be handshake lines, autograph sessions, and a full-on parade with everyone cheering. Douglas nearly choked on his own shock at what he just said, especially once the reporter brought up the parade, but then he snapped into it, admitting he'd asked to see the paper ever since that day, and it had drawn massive interest, and Douglas finally blurted out, "I'm so sorry." What? The reporter spun around, baffled, just as Douglas bolted and yelled that he didn't want any of that, so the reporter demanded he stop and, at the very least, sign his autograph. Crowds poured out of their houses to catch a glimpse of the idol, but only one shadowy figure stared down at a ripped scrap of newspaper showing Douglas in close-up, crushing a girl to his chest. The next day rolled in and the street stayed dead quiet, no footsteps, no noise, until one lone door in the tavern slammed shut, and sharp, frantic steps started pounding up the stairs toward something urgent. Douglas and Ravi pulled up to the spot just as the guys there claimed they'd made it in perfect time, because apparently Douglas had totally mentioned he'd be showing up today, and the bearded man in the chair was already nodding like it was written in stone. His ears stayed razor-sharp like always, then and now. Ham the dwarf was the one spilling the info, and Douglas kept saying the same thing. Ham hadn't changed a bit, not since their old days. He makes his living selling secrets for cash and playing the middleman in quests the guilds never touch. But that's not even the best part, because he's sitting on intel nobody else has, and he's got the clout to seize an entire country. Douglas pressed him about his business, and Ham admitted he was gathering intel, yet the brokering quests were a bust because there just weren't enough adventurers to pull off special tasks. Ham realized Douglas was hunting a fat-paying quest, and when he stepped in, he had a few nasty ones ready to shove his way. Then Douglas blurted an apology, saying he should have warned him from the start. Douglas didn't care if the pay was small, he only wanted safe work, period. And since he didn't want any trouble anymore, Ham figured he couldn't change it, not when Douglas had someone to protect now. But then it happened, he threw his pen down mid-scratch, and it kept writing all by itself, catching Ham's eye so fast that Ham snapped, "Hold on a second," because a brand new assignment just hit him. Robbie thought she was his dad headed to work. Douglas shut that down fast, saying, "No, she's coming with me," then warned they might have to ditch Baltsac for a few days depending on the assignment, but they'd be back the moment it was done. Douglas promised he'd go play with Diana later, and Robbie lit up like a spark, grinning in disbelief that her father actually said it, while Ham just sat there, smiling as he watched father and daughter beam at each other. Suddenly he blurted out that he had the perfect choice, though he couldn't find the right words, then snapped that only Douglas could take on this quest, and the man slammed a sheet of paper onto the table. This quest was handed down by a rich man, and the reward was insanely huge, 50 gold coins. Douglas knew it sounded too good to be true, but he still couldn't ignore it until the fear of kidnapping hit him, because it sure as hell wasn't safe. Ham snapped that it wasn't a kidnapping at all. This was a mission to hunt down a tycoon's daughter who'd fled home, and he swore it was Tolkien and his daughter Bridget who vanished a few days back. Bridget was 17 and this was her second escape, so yeah, they'd been clashing all the time, right down to the quest giver, Tolkien's secretary. All that remained was to hunt his daughter, drag her back home, and call that the quest. But if her trail had gone cold for days, then Douglas would have plenty of territory to scour. Ham even swore she looked like she was somewhere near town. Douglas snapped to the truth. No matter how close she was, he still couldn't spot her. Ham shot back, "Exactly. That's why it looks like my daughter hired someone using illusion magic," and the man knew this twist would make everything way harder. After all, that insanely advanced trick he used in the city earlier, slamming illusion to hide him and Ravi like the curse, then yanking it mid-cast to mess with the spell and shut it down, was next level. Ham said that's exactly why tracking down his daughter was a nightmare for any normal adventurer, so he spoke up before the job landed on his desk, but a guild messenger tried it first and got kicked out almost immediately. Douglas couldn't wrap his head around it. Ham told him the only reason this even worked was pure luck. He found her, knocked her out, and dragged her home. Then his daughter woke up halfway through and bolted for freedom, and that escape wrecked everything. But somehow the magnate snapped at the adventurer and tossed him into pure hell, because any father would rage if his beloved daughter got hurt, and Ham just jabbed at Douglas, saying he was the best for the job. Because hurting his daughter is off limits, and this mission means he has to drag her safely back home. If he dares to take the job, he starts with a toy berry, and then Ham has to prep the ship while he digs up every last detail. Ravi couldn't wait to set sail on that boat. Douglas stepped in, confirmed it, and told him the Toyberry was a tourist hotspot, famous for beaches so beautiful they look unreal. And whenever they got a breather, Douglas pushed Ravi to go swimming together since the heat had been brutal lately. He swore it would feel amazing, and Ravi lit up and said yes right away. Ham watched the two happy people and grinned. Ham said it was all decided right then and he'd call them, and the departure was set for tomorrow, but at that exact moment, some guy dropped down from above and hit the floor like a bomb, shocking everyone in the room. Douglas shot up from his seat, instantly trying to shield Ravi because someone had it out for him. Even when they stayed together, the second Douglas got sent solo, he still showed up here, so he didn't waste time. He raced back to the city, grabbed his powers again, and didn't let anyone catch him off guard. Douglas stared at Dario as he demanded Ham give him this quest too, promising easy cash. Dario wasn't just some nobody. He used to run with the heroes group, and he's a kamikaze swordsman. Two shadowy figures loomed on the embankment as the city sat in pitch darkness. Dario perched on a rock, stunned that Douglas had finally shown up, and Douglas greeted him with a sharp good morning, then said they had to hurry. At last, the men picked up the pace along the embankment, and in Douglas's arms, Ravi lay fast asleep, while the man who stood beside them stared at his old comrade and flashed a barely there smile. Their chat went sideways fast. One claimed things were cool now, and the other shrugged like it didn't matter, saying it probably was. The first pushed harder, asking where the harbor was, and the second just tossed back another cold, indifferent reply. Yeah, that's why they were still trudging along. Douglas strolled forward with a forced smile, feeling painfully out of place, because this whole thing was so important that they had to move as a group, so he barely ever got a moment to talk to any of them one-on-one. And yeah, maybe it's those rumors about Dario, but one way or another, he can't stand working with him, and this whole quest to find the runaway daughter might be the only thing that decides whether everything's really going to be okay. He had to kick off a conversation, pushing Dario to talk and grilling him about what happened lately, since he'd heard Dario ditch the hero group, but the moment he asked, Dario went silent. Douglas thought he'd messed up again, and right then, Dario started laughing. He quickly blurted that his delicate habit whenever things got awkward hadn't gotten any better at all. Then he forced out an awkward smile. Birds wheeled across the sky, and then the word hit. Doug got into a brutal fight with Alan. Dario confirmed it, saying they kept botching quests even when the Demon King wasn't involved, so he grabbed his stuff and left the group. Douglas demanded answers because he'd heard Dario was furious about exile, and Dario snapped back that he never said any of it. Those claims were dirty rumors fueled by blind faith, and Douglas shot back a quick apology on the spot. I decided to clear up one more thing, material well-being. Dario admitted it, he didn't have much money at all. After all that, he finally snags a new weapon, but it snaps so fast it's almost cursed, and since he split from the group, every shop keeps hounding him for payment, then refuses to let him charge it, even though he never even got to keep it. Dario said that was the moment he realized Douglas was in town, and it felt like pure luck. Then Douglas' face flipped instantly. Still, Dario talked like everything was fine, like nothing could touch him, yet the hate in his bones for that guy was crystal clear. Then Dario snapped his head around and said, "That's it." Douglas was completely baffled. Dario said the hero group isn't just random, it's a squad of chosen talent, and once you're in, you instantly earn quest access, rock-solid trust, and amazing rewards. In his later years, the old man was weak to the bone, so pitiful you almost couldn't bear to look at him, and that's why even though he could have just retired, his desperate urge to win over the heroes made it seem like he was quietly trying to slow them down. Daria couldn't believe her eyes when Douglas, their old leader, showed up like that, but once she saw he was finally healthy and had wiped out every last debt, the hate just couldn't stick, and she was shocked by how openly honest he was. The boy snapped back that he was Edmund, the wise man, but he was dying to know why he'd gotten so weak, and Douglas hesitated, wondering whether he should spill the truth. But then it hit him he couldn't keep this bottled up. He clutched Robbie tighter and blurted the truth. Alan had cursed him. Right as he finished, Dario spun around and burst into loud, hearty laughter. Dario's stomach seized from non-stop laughter, because Douglas's icy face looked so brutally cruel. Dario couldn't even figure out what he'd done to deserve it, and even Douglas had no clue why he'd acted that way. Tears burned in Dario's eyes as he tried to guess what Dario was up to, and Douglas looked stunned. Then the guy snapped that he shouldn't act dumb, because he'd come back here on purpose, didn't he, to beat the hell out of Alan. But Douglas's answer didn't line up with Dario's opinion at all, because Douglas wasn't trying to argue. He just wanted to hand the ring back and be done with it, and when the guy told him to take it to the guild and leave it there, he refused to give a satisfactory response on his own free will. Douglas mulled it over and said, "I just want to talk." He figured he'd ask why he did it, whether Alan was holding a grudge, then he breathed out because at least he hadn't run into him. He doubted he even should meet him, but right then Ravi jolted awake in his arms, stretched like crazy, and Douglas blurted out a cheerful "good morning." She fired back the same smile, glanced at Dario, and watched his face twist with pure displeasure. Ravi snapped back to every moment with him and stared at her father, confused and pleading for answers. Dario smirked, saying she looked like a doll, and Douglas froze, then blurted that she was his charming daughter, while Dario quietly convinced himself that he'd somehow gone dumb right along with her. Right then the names started flying, on top of a half-dragon, half-human figure who was calling them straight to him, because Ham had told him everything, and now he just needed to bring them to Toy Berry. The man stepped forward and introduced himself as Vaigyo, the ship's captain. Douglas nodded and said, "Yep, that's exactly why he had to look after them." Dario shot daggers at the huge lizard, and Douglas tried to soothe him, until Ravi blurts, "You're a lizard too." So Dario immediately began apologizing, but the lizard only laughed and said, "Relax, it's all fine, that's just baby talk." What? Vaigyo said they could go, and the anchor finally started to lift. Then the ship surged forward and set sail. Ravi stared at the sea, grinning like this was pure magic. As the sun climbed into the sky, Robbie threw her arms wide and grinned like a sunrise, while Douglas stood behind her, eyes locked on his daughter. The lizard snapped to the fact she was on a ship for the first time. The girl nodded to prove it, and Vaigyo told her she should be thrilled. until his curiosity sparked again, and he demanded to know what was for food. Douglas figured the ship had to have food. Diageo shrugged and said it was fine. Toy Berry was only a half-day hike along the coast, and they might haul in some fish. Ravi figured out he'd catch fish with a net, and the lizard told him it works great in rivers, but not from this far away, so she demanded he wait, insisting she'd let Ravi see everything with her own eyes. The lizard shot its tongue out, and Ravi and Douglas froze in shock. Then it started yanking fish from the sea and flinging them onto the boat until it was basically loading the deck. And now he felt like it should have been more than enough. Ravi couldn't stop staring at all those fish, while Douglas was blown away by the sheer brilliance of the technique. Vaigyo broke into a grin and bragged that this was his one and only specialty. Then he snapped his gaze to Douglas because he'd just figured it out. Magic could do it since you could eat it raw, and they had to wipe out those parasites. He also heard that mastering magic with surgical precision was exhausting, and if he wanted, he could freeze the whole box. Douglas tried to test whether it'd work, and the lizard snapped around, mouth wide in surprise because it definitely didn't expect that. The fish was flash frozen, and the lizard stared in disbelief. Douglas looked a bit annoyed and said, "I've done this before." The lizard grinned and promised, "I'll thaw it now, but you've got to wait, then I'll season it too." Vaigyo marched out with the fish on a tray, insisted he'd handled it already, and demanded it look perfect, because that tray was stacked with neatly sliced pieces, ready to impress. Everyone buzzed with anticipation. Then Vaigyo showed up with raw fish, and the whole vibe shattered. Dario swore he'd never tasted anything like it. Robbie immediately cracked, "That's not even edible," and Douglas. He didn't back down. He zeroed in on the sauce like it was the whole mystery. The lizard snapped that it was soy sauce, made the same way they ferment grains, and then dropped the real bomb. His older brother was trading with an eastern country, selling it as a local dish just to pull off the deal. Robbie clocked the black color. Vaigyo immediately figured they weren't into it, since if they wanted it cooked, the lizard would never finish cooking because Dario snatched a piece and dunked it straight in the sauce. He shoved it into his mouth, and Douglas and Ravi were stunned. Then Dario's face snapped to total disbelief as he tasted it and blurted, "Whoa, that's delicious." The boy went on praising the sweet and salty flavor like it was pure magic, and the lizard just laughed, urging him to take more and calling him a kid. Dario snapped that he wasn't some kid, and Ravi plus Douglas exchanged a look with forks still in hand. They grabbed a bite and tried it, and the girl lit up, delicious. While her father tasted something offbeat, then realized, yeah, it was delicious. The lizard bragged that he had more spices. One of them was green, and Dario snapped that it was spicy, so the captain got the message. It was way too early for kids. A scorching sun blazed just overhead as the ship cut forward, waves crashing hard against its sides, and Dario slumped against the hull, and the whole thing groaned and creaked with every jolt. Dario snapped at the pitching, terrified the ship would sink, and though Douglas tried to stop him, the lizard hissed that the pitching was way too strange to ignore. Even with the wind and waves looking calm, Ravi, who should have trusted the 12th elder brother's weather instincts, caught something wild. The lizard had 12 elder brothers of its own, and Ravi couldn't help blurting out, "I've only got 15 brothers and sisters." What? The lizard snapped to the truth. She was an only child, so she'd never know what it's like to juggle a house full of brothers and sisters, and that thought felt like a headache. Then, out of nowhere, Ravi shot up and snatched her clothes. Douglas stared at her confused and feared something was wrong. Then Ravi's face tightened. He started to tremble, and she insisted. Nothing happened. The man stared at her confused, but the lizard decided she'd gone out of her mind and told her she could rest in the room below. Then, out of nowhere, the ship started to go haywire. The man had no clue what was happening. Then one of the lizards snapped to the captain and with a grim voice warned him. The ship was being attacked by a giant squid. Tentacles lunged and clamped onto the Karma, and the lizards panicked, scrambling upward to flee. Then the squid surged, smashed into the side of the ship with raw tentacle power, and Vaigyo's eyes went wide with shock and pure disappointment as he screamed, because the squid just wrecked his Prince of the Breeze. Douglas snapped to attention, a kraken, and his shock hit hard because this was an S-rank monster, the kind you never expect to crawl out of waters like these. Douglas roared as he tried to grab Dario, but Dario had already burst away, cackling at the top of his lungs, then sprinted straight for the kraken like it was nothing, and Douglas couldn't believe the speed, even faster than when he'd known him, like his legs weren't even needing to be reinforced. Before the quest even kicked off, Dario's already itching for fun, grinning as he unleashes magic weapons like the scattering blade, and even calls down a meteor shower. The kraken erupted in a blood-curdling scream as meteorites slammed into it at breakneck speed. A violent whirlwind tore through the blade, and it shattered into tiny pieces. Daria stared at his shattered sword like it had betrayed him, then knew it had hit its breaking point. He shot a glare at the kraken, and the lizards behind him hung on his every move, because even they expected a hero from someone who'd once fought in a legendary squad. Douglas stared at Dario's work in pure disbelief. Then the kraken jerked, splashing down and missing several tentacles, and the ship immediately battered itself against the pounding waves. Ravi started to sway hard left and right, and everyone scrambled to stay upright, but the ground won and she crashed to the floor. Douglas immediately panicked, darted in, and tried to check if Ravi was okay. The girl had a scraped knee that throbbed in pain, but she forced a sad smile and swore everything was fine. Then Douglas saw it and his heart dropped like something was wrong. Dario was crouched on the ship's bow when the ocean erupted. The kraken shot up from the depths, screaming and roaring like it on the sea, and Dario lunged for his sword, only to realize it was broken in his hand. Dario yanked back fast and the kraken immediately snapped in confusion, because he didn't dodge on his own. He'd been flung backward by wind magic, the kind Douglas uses, and when Dario finally realized it, he screamed at the man for messing everything up. Douglas summoned his spells, and those wings of solitude sealed off the frozen lands like a fortress, while Daria just stared at him, baffled. Then Douglas promised, "Don't worry, I'll handle it." Douglas sobbed with rage, yelling that right now he'd unleash Raxus's deadliest ice falcon. Then he ordered the beast to freeze him as it rocketed into the sky, heading straight for the kraken. A bird darted right up to the kraken and boom, they started clawing at each other, while the falcon's icy grip began freezing it over and over, until the kraken's screams rose louder and louder. A deadly ice block slammed into place where the kraken stood, and the whole ship went silent with shock, while the lizards burst with joy, finally sure they were saved. Dario's jaw dropped at what Douglas just did. He remembered their last run, fighting a normal monster, and how Douglas moved like it was second nature, so a shaky, nervous grin flickered across his face. A man loomed on the stairs while Douglas and Ravi sat in the cabin right beside them, and their father crouched over his daughter's injured knee, working the wound like it was the most urgent fight of his life. He unleashed his usual full healing, and Ravi's knee stayed completely untouched. Douglas immediately apologized, frantic to make sure she felt zero pain after that, and the girl nodded. She was totally fine. Suddenly, the door creaked open and Dario slipped into the cabin, eyes blazing with disgust, as he snapped that they'd shove off in half an hour and move the squid to another ship, then leaned in to say they'd get a massive payout for calming the informant. Dario leaned in, desperate for an answer, and burning with curiosity about that ice magic, because there was no way he could be stronger now than he was in his peak days, and honestly, you don't see top-class magic like that every day. Ravi pressed her again about the top class, and every single time her face lit up in surprise at Dario's words, because even she couldn't believe he'd laid out something so simple like skill rating, and Dario stood there shocked too. In this world, there's basic magic everyone learns, then first-class magic that can reshape objects or jack up their power, and if you're talking about magic that births life itself, that's high magic. And yeah, full healing is basically high-class magic, and it looked like he could use it with ease, but he didn't bother wasting it on some minor scratches. Dario snapped that even his useless fanny couldn't use him. Douglas cut in and begged him to stop, and Dario doubled down, saying it straight and raw. Ravi just watched, crushed, as it all went down. Ravi whipped around to her father and blurted that she wanted to train in magic too, her eyes begging for his blessing. Then Douglas stared back with full-on distrust, feeling crushed, and finally gave a sarcastic, awkward sure, just to keep his daughter from getting upset. Robbie had been training with magic ever since Floria's days in the elven forest, but nothing worked, no results, not even a spark, so he dropped into a squat beside her, already racking his brain for what he could do to fix this. Robbie kept her hands spread just a little apart, and Douglas immediately sensed she wanted something from him, so he started plotting every way they could reach the city, but she never let her hands come any closer. Douglas stared at her with heartbreak in his eyes, still burning over ways to help, while Dario finally stepped in and spoke, because he just realized she couldn't use magic at all, so Ravi sank even deeper into sadness. Dario said maybe she just didn't have the skill yet, but the guy smirked at her like he already won, while Ravi fired back, pushing hard to prove she truly had what it took. Douglas backed her up and swore her potential was no less than 5,000, and Dario shrugged that it was plenty to belong to the lower upper class, because the sage class had to start at around 8,000. He shrugged it off like it didn't matter one bit and asked her straight up what kind of magic she wanted to learn, and she lit up, light magic. Dario pressed her on why that exact spell. This old man's magic wasn't new to her, and she'd already seen plenty of others, but she still refused everything and chose the magic of light anyway. Turns out the first magic didn't just happen, it sparked a crazy urge, and he pressed her to recall why she was pulled toward the magic of light and whether she's naturally suited for it. If she cracked the trick, she'd learn it in no time, and Dario just stood there like some real teacher, while Ravi sat on the bed, soaking up every word, listening hard but not saying a thing. Douglas couldn't believe his eyes when Dario stepped in to help, and he stared right back, no blinking, because he still couldn't wrap his head around why someone so serious would suddenly offer advice. Dario's eyes widened when Douglas stared at him that way, because didn't he already know all this? Before he could even process it, Douglas blurted out a panicked apology, and Dario just felt completely stuck in that awkward, stunned silence. Ravi lit up when he heard Douglas admit he's terrible at putting his feelings into words, so Ravi wanted to tell her something too, but the words just wouldn't come. Ravi blushed and timidly called the boy Big Brother, then leaned in with pure curiosity. She just had to see what kind of magic he could learn first. Dario stared back, totally thrown off, mixing confusion and surprise in his eyes. Douglas suddenly realized this could be a deadly lesson for his daughter, so he shot his hands up, trying to yank Dario back, because he was the only hero in the group who couldn't use magic, and he panicked trying to stop her. But to Douglas's shock, that guy's answer flipped his opinion fast, because the guy admitted he'd already forgotten what magic even was, and then he grinned in this weird, unsettling way. At that exact moment, Dario snapped that he was heading to bed, then later leaned in and told Ravi that her daddy needed to teach her everything else, while the boy's behavior kept flipping the script, leaving Douglas staring with his mouth still hanging open in shock. He hustled to the door, yanked it open, and snapped that whoever was coming should wake him when they hit Toy Berry. Then he didn't even wait for a reply, just thanked them and slammed it shut. After that, he marched to his cabin and left the father and daughter stranded together. Dario strode down the corridor, his mind racing with something he couldn't shake. Then the guy planted his hands on his hips, dipped his head, and Dario's way was lit by just one ship's lantern. Just as the boy stepped out, the cabin door swung open, and Douglas peered out like he'd been watching all along, then dropped the line that he was shockingly good at looking after people, and the boy froze in disbelief. Douglas admitted he had zero clue he even had a side like that, then OTA. Dario snapped, saying he'd done it just for fun, and Douglas stared in total confusion. Then, after a quick pause, he admitted he was happy for him, but it was clear the guy still had no clue what any of it meant. He was seconds from leaving, but Douglas wouldn't shut up, because the moment he heard their earlier conversation, it clicked, and he realized he hadn't handled it well at all, and somehow their words dragged up whatever had been boiling in him. Daria stared at him like a stone statue, said nothing, then he inched his foot forward, and the guy burst out laughing. That hit him like a brick to the head. He clapped a hand there and balked, because the guy warned him not to dig into the past again, or Alan would flip out at her for it. Still, Douglas's patience snapped, and irritation burned into full-blown anger. He snapped right away that it didn't matter what he meant, there was no room for doubt. Then the man started stuttering, and that grind on Dario's nerves until his face tightened with pure annoyance. Right after the tense silence, the guy snapped that he wasn't the Chibai's blood at all. Then he slapped the old man insult on him again, and said he wasn't her kin either, and Douglas instantly felt his face burn with embarrassment. The man nodded, claiming he felt like they were finally a real family now. Then Dario snapped, dead certain she'd already caught on, and Douglas just stared at her, utterly lost. Dario paused, then blurted out that he had one, then added loud and clear that he had a family too, and they weren't related. 10 years back, when he was only 12, they called Dario to the table, and that's where it all began. A cheerful little boy nodded and happily agreed to go eat, and that's how he ended up in a village where only kids lived, and he grew up in one nameless place there.